Welcome, everybody. This is the second of what's going to be many regional Zoom meetings on the question of climate displacement. We're going to do probably, one, two, three, or four for each region of the world in the coming 6 months as part of this project that we're putting on that's already been going about 6 months. Commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Peninsula Principles on Climate Displacement within States, which is an initiative that we spearheaded back starting in about 2011, and then it culminated on the 18th of August 2013 with the adoption of the Peninsula Principles. So that's in a couple days' time, and we have a whole slew of media activities currently underway for the next sort of 96 hours that we've been working on for the last 6 months. And so this meeting of ours today coincides nicely with that. I'm sure you already have the materials and are generally familiar with the Peninsula Principles, so I won't go into it much other than to say that they have been quite influential in the past decade in terms of influencing national policies and laws and practices by civil society groups, governments, UN agencies, special rapporteurs, and others in emphasizing the simple point that every climate displaced person in the world has rights, and it's incumbent on all states in the world to take them seriously and to treat everybody displaced by climate change as a rights holder. So on that note, today's meeting is the first of several that we're going to have on Asia. And we have several others lined up for people that are in different time zones and things like that. But just to, remind the world that this is going to be recorded. So we'll put this online in a sort of condensed version in a few weeks' time. And we'll do that similarly with all the other regional meetings. So you can refer to that to your networks and colleagues. As we know, Asia is going to be the place where probably 80% of the people who are threatened with or actually displaced by climate change live today. So far and above the most heavily impacted region in the world. And the objective today is not really to go through all the cities that are going to be impacted and all the places and all the consequences of climate change and how it's going to manifest and everything else and how hot it is. And, we all know those things. Our real target with these meetings is to try to put our minds together and really try to come up with creative ways of better addressing the threat of climate displacement and then the remedy of climate displacement when it can't be prevented. What can we put out there into the ether that will inspire governments, UN agencies, civil society groups, and others, donors, to do much more than they have done to date on this question, particularly from a rights-based perspective that ensures that every single person everywhere gets a decent amount of attention to their plight, so that they're, at the very least, their housing, land, and property rights and all of their rights are actually respected in the context of any displacement that they are going to endure. And by using the term climate displacement, just to be clear, we mean all forms of people being coercively forced to move from their homes, whether it's through processes of so-called migration, or actual outright displacement, or any other cause that leads them to feel compelled to leave where they're living now. So we've been working on this question for a long time, really obviously, like our name implies, from the perspective of solutions, and trying to put out there into the world various ways by which climate displacement can be tackled. Everything from putting together the first sort of land-based deal in Papua New Guinea concerning the Carteret Islands back in 2007, up until recently, where we've been proposing things like the establishment of climate land banks in countries so that land can be held in trust for climate displaced people, promoting the idea of climate displacement havens so that rural areas that are losing populations can be turned around by trying to attract new migrants, new displaced persons who are displaced because of climate change, and then revitalize the population base of some of these rural areas throughout the world, which are having difficulty surviving as the population outflow increases towards cities. And then ultimately just coming up with ways by which we can reduce the default option of most climate displaced people in the world, which will surely be into the slums and popular settlements of the world for lack of any other viable option. So we've been pushing for these things and working on these things all across the world, well, for nearly 20 years now. And so what we're hoping for today is for each of us here to, put on the table any new ideas that you want to propose, any innovative thinking, any lessons that you may have learned on these questions, anything that will push the ball forward, because I think all of us know, notwithstanding how deeply involved we are in this question of climate displacement per se, but that no institution has yet done enough. No, there are no perfect solutions to this problem. There are no doors on which we can knock and be assured of finding a solution to whether an individual family's plight or a whole nation's plight. We're really only at the beginning phases of what will clearly be one of the biggest crises that our species as humans has ever faced. And the numbers now, even when I started working on this question almost 20 years ago, the numbers that were used at that time to estimate the scale of climate displacement over time seem like, fantasy, positive fantasies, given how bad the situation has become in just 2 decades, let alone what awaits us in coming decades. And you never see estimates lower than 250 million nowadays. And some estimates go, even 10 times higher than that. So without further ado, and so what I would love to have happen here is for each of you to make a 10-minute statement just in accordance with the agenda, and then we can have discussion and questions after that, and then wrap it up. So with that, let me give the floor to ROG Raviji.
Scott, that's putting me a bit on the spot, but I guess the simple response is that we have to first accept that there's going to be massive displacement. Right? I think we're in deep denial at all levels, at the intergovernmental level, at national level, and sometimes at local level. That's the first thing. The second thing is displacement is already happening. It's not measured adequately, but it's happening pretty much across the world, and certainly in some parts of Asia. I mean, sociologists and anthropologists are picking this up a little bit, so are people in the climate business. But as in the general question of displacement around development, there isn't an adequate recognition of that politically, economically, certainly, and I would say in the legal systems, because at least in many parts of the world that we live in, especially in Asia, our legal systems sometimes lag these questions by 2-3 decades, a generation or more. So in a sense, it's a deep challenge. You don't recognize. First is it's happening at an accelerating rate. Secondly, it's happening to people who are invisible. And the third thing is that the systems that exist are just not willing to accept this kind of stuff. Yeah, and you can see that all the way from the intergovernmental negotiations, the kind of challenges it's taken us. We don't have an adaptation goal or a set of adaptation goals. We don't even have a framework for discussing that, which means that there's no evidence-based way of trying to address losses and damages. And because you don't have that, there's no way that legal frameworks, whichever jurisdictional kind of frame that you will work with, civil law, common law, et cetera, there's no way of making the connection into that frame. So it's a deep challenge, fine. And most of what's happening on adaptation, I'm sure all of our colleagues here are very aware of this, is happening either in a fragmented manner in terms of planned adaptation, or it's happening with people doing what they think they should be doing, but they have no clue about where things are coming from, what rights they have, etc. And the other context, of course, in Asia in particular, is because of our population pressures. Some of the core questions you're talking about, which are kind of, lie at the heart of the Peninsula Principles, which is about land, for example, and things that are tied to land. because in many jurisdictions, like in, let's say, in India or in much of South Asia, access to water, groundwater, is kind of tied to land, fine. So if you're landless, if are a marginal farmer or you're a marginal player in an urban system, you actually don't have rights to water. And in some senses, apart from heat, it is the challenge of too much or too little water that's going to determine what's actually going to happen in some ways, fine. So yeah, I mean, we are really at the beginning of trying to understand the question. Jurisprudence is, environmental jurisprudence is in a very bad situation. India has just seen a massive rollback in whatever 30, 40 years of environmental legislation over the last couple of weeks. So let's say things are not. I would not even say nice. Things are in a fairly desperate situation at the moment, and I'll come back maybe later after we've heard everybody else on the scale of what we expect to see, because I think they're much larger questions. We're working in some senses, even with this kind of initiative, on kind of band-aid solutions. Fine, there are much deeper questions that are going to play themselves out, not now, but certainly in the next 20 years, as food security crisis, as water security crisis assume continental scale or cross-continental scale. What Europe is sort of has been very concerned about, of course, been washed out now currently by Ukraine, by the movement from the Middle East and North Africa, is actually not even a warm-up or a precursor to the kind of population movements that we'd be expecting to see in other parts of the world, including in in the Pacific, in other locations. So yeah, I don't want to start on a really nasty note, but that's the way things are at the moment. And there's little bits of things that we gain here and there, but I don't think it's adding up to anything systemic. And this is a deep systemic crisis.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask one question before we move to Chandi, just while we're fresh on what you just said. To what extent does the government of India, country with the world's largest population now, realize the extent of this problem within your country, at least?
Well, whether it's the government of India or the state governments, or even whatever local governments in some senses, we haven't historically been deeply acceptance of any forms of displacement. Fine. Climate displacement is a new category in some senses. We know that quite well. So, land-based conflict, there were some responses to this that have taken place because of a whole range of different, sometimes legislation, sometimes, social and environmental movements over the last 20 or 30 years. But they've been localized. For example, I mean, to take a particular example, we have a very large part of India that's notionally under state control, in what are called sort of, we have something called the Forest Act, and forests are about 30% of India's land area, which at one level seems fairly interesting in the context of the latest biodiversity, convention and stuff like that. But in actual fact, the challenge is, because of our large population, is we have a large number of people living in forests, historically indigenous and otherwise. And we have a lot of people obviously living near forests who depend on them for their livelihoods. Forests are going to be deeply impacted, not only because of climate change, but because both India and many other countries are going to try and implement over the next 20 years or so, as we head into 1.5 and then maybe even 2 degrees overshoot, which is kind of unthinkable in some senses. They're going to be trying to implement a lot of land-based measures to capture carbon. Right? So essentially, some of it is going to be to conserving forest stock, and the legislative framework for that, I think, is going to be, there are a lot of contradictory signals in that space. The second thing is actually converting areas which are considered to be wasteland at the moment. It's been going on for 30, 40 years, into areas in which you actually, you try and hold carbon stocks. And that, of course, is critically related to land ownership and, like I said, water availability. And these are critical things. And these are, questions in deep conflict, and deep shortages, pretty much across the subcontinent. I mean, I don't know what our colleagues from Bangladesh will kind of say, or Nepal, or whatever it is. So it's not only a question of climate displacement now, it's also the implication of what will happen as we have to sequester carbon. And the only thing that we know how to do just now is actually plant trees. And, there are all kinds of very interesting and somewhat dangerous, I would say, initiatives to build trillions of trees in various parts of the world. So in areas which are land scarce, in which land conflict is the underlying relationship that you find in agrarian and even urban relations, this is a very complicated question. So I think the climate displacement question is also related to how land use is going to be governed. And so, if you don't accept that displacement is happening in a significant way in any case, there are deep debates about migration. Forget about displacement, right? And then on top of that, you're going to be sort of institutionalizing large land use changes in an environment which has got serious issues because of, flooding or being able to not actually, implement agricultural activity properly or equitably, etc. Then you have a completely different landscape we're talking about. And I'm not even going as far as geoengineering. Geoengineering is a kind of, it's a intergovernmental and a much larger scale thing. But these are things that we have to prepare for, because we are absolutely on the pathway to an overshoot. 1.5 overshoot is kind of almost locked in. I co-led that 1.5 report, and it's been a number of years, but we're going completely in the wrong direction systemically. So yeah, this is probably true of most governments in some senses. It's very convenient and nice to talk about climate change at the moment, but we don't actually, we're not embracing the systemic solutions that we require in every system to address these questions. We know what these solutions are, at least from the science side, and I would say to some extent from the policy side. But these would upend a whole range of political settlements that exist from the local to the national level. I think that's the difference between climate displacement, or let's say climate-related questions, and other questions, right? Because we have a rights framework that may be in place. Some governments don't kind of think very much of them, depending on who they are and where they're going. But this is a completely new class of problem in some senses. At least that's my take on it.
Thank you very much, Aro. So over to Chandi now. How about your thoughts on these questions, Chandi?
Sure. So I have a few slides which I'll just quickly run through. First, I just wanted to give a bit of what we were thinking about this in the IPCC. I was a lead author for the Asia chapter in the recent IPCC report on adaptation and impacts and vulnerability. And these are exactly these questions of displacement, but also just seasonal migration and just mobility, movement of people was something that we were talking a lot about. But unfortunately, although we understand the scale of the problem, I think there's still significant knowledge gaps that we need to address. So the IPCC was somehow bound by the gaps in these spaces that we really couldn't. We know this from the field, but we weren't able to report it in the IPCC report as strongly as we wanted to. So let me just quickly share my screen. I'll go over it very fast and then leave enough time for discussion. So I'm going to be talking a bit, I talk about mobility because it moves from forced displacement to autonomous movement of people and seasonal migration, daily commuting also in many places in South Asia, but also other parts of the world. So I guess the first thing is just to again reiterate what Aro was saying. I think from the IPCC's Working Group 2 report, we know that very clearly climate change is impacting both human well-being, so societal systems, but also ecosystems. And both of these things are extremely linked, and changes in one system sort of impacts the other. And I think that is what is this challenge of trying to protect ecosystems while also enabling human well-being in all its forms, both material and non-material well-being. And the second big finding, I think, from the report is that while there's a lot of evidence that countries, cities, and other smaller places at the local level are implementing adaptation actions, which is basically measures to reduce risk to climate change. This progress is, first of all, uneven. It's very specific to certain sectors. So you'll have projects talking about adaptation in agriculture or something related to flood management, but there's no systemic understanding of how do you adapt and change entire systems of farming, of certain economic sectors, and really trying to think about risk management holistically. The other big finding is that most of the adaptation actions that we see currently are very risk specific. So you've got a flood resilience strategy or a heat action plan, but nothing that looks at these in their entirety. And then finally, the biggest concern, I think, is that there are increasing gaps between current adaptation and what we actually need. So this is what we call the adaptation gap. And there are lots of assessments done in the report which talk about the fact that this adaptation gap is highest for the poorest people. So the most vulnerable are actually seeing the largest gaps in adaptation, which is exactly what we don't want to do. So coming back to that rights-based approach, actually the people who have currently the least voice and agency are the ones who are seeing the largest gaps in adaptation. Now, why I'm giving this context is because one of the big stories was that, is migration and displacement a form of adaptation or not? And this is what we really struggled with. We were doing this very intense negotiation with all the governments during the IPCC report's plenary approval. And this is really just a figure that talks about the different systems that need to be transitioned to meet goals of 1.5 degrees. These are the risks they face. And then there are a range of adaptation strategies that are there. And here down at the bottom, you see this focus on planned relocation and resettlement and human migration. And we spent nearly half a day with the countries, especially the small island developing states, to talk about whether planned relocation and resettlement is an adaptation strategy or is it just a response to climate change. And I think we don't have a good answer to that. And that's why you see this footnote where, the governments were not comfortable with talking about planned relocation as an adaptation strategy, because it sort of then says that people can endlessly adapt, and it opens the door to more relocation of people from very vulnerable locations. So I think there's of course, all of us are aware of these political sensitivities around these things, but they somehow tend to then become a block in thinking about inclusive and safe relocation and enabling that process. And just to walk you through the rest of this figure, what we really did is try to understand the feasibility of, or the possibility of implementing these kinds of mobility-related options. And we find that actually in many places, if you look at planned relocation, these little dots show that first of all, the feasibility is really low. So on a range of dimensions that are up there, the feasibility of planned relocation is extremely low. And what that means is there are still very significant barriers, economic, technological, institutional barriers to ensuring that planned relocation is actually a good strategy, an effective adaptation strategy. So that's, I think the literature at least confirms what we've been seeing on the ground, that it's not always the most feasible and effective strategy when you think about risk reduction. The other big thing to highlight is that there were significant knowledge gaps. We just didn't have enough evidence to sometimes make the links between relocation, displacement, and these different dimensions of feasibility. So it's also a call to the research and maybe practice community as well to sort of bridge these knowledge gaps. Okay, moving on then, I guess, so that's, on the one hand, I mean, we talk about displacement and movement as sort of a way to reduce risk and reduce exposure to extreme events. But we also know on the other side that at least this, if you look at this column that I've highlighted, I mean, we did an assessment of what are the key impacts of climate change on various human systems. And displacement, of course, there's a high, the dark blue colors talk about the confidence levels, and we have a really high confidence level that, for example, in Asia, you see that there are negative impacts of displacement with very high confidence. So I think in that space, we do know that climate change is driving displacement, and there's very little, or there's very robust evidence to suggest that. There are, of course, some regions where that evidence is not as robust, and maybe that's another pointer, I guess, to show that there are gaps in our knowledge and we are unable to assess some of these things at the level that we want to in the IPCC. I think this is a figure that many of you must be familiar with. It's from the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, which really shows how largely the Asia-Pacific region is impacted by and seeing displacement, internal displacement. And I'm keen to focus on internal displacement because there seems to be in the climate change discourse, really this discourse about millions of climate refugees crossing international borders, and often the crossing happening from the global south to the global north. But we know from a lot of evidence from our own countries that actually a lot of movement, much more larger volumes of movement, happen within country borders. And that's really, we need to keep reminding ourselves of that, and also then pushing that message out that a lot of displacement is internal. And just to give a few numbers from the Asia context, because I was involved in writing that section on displacement and migration in the Asia chapter. Of course, we know the numbers. This is from 2023 data and only focusing on disaster-related displacement. But there is evidence, of course, that there are lots of rapid onset events like cyclones, floods, and extreme storms that are causing displacements. But what I found in the literature, there's a less emphasis on slow onset events like drought, like heat, which might also be visible across many seasons and many years. And so this again denotes a knowledge gap where we're not paying enough attention first to slow onset events, but also then to how these rapid and slow onset events, when they come together, they sort of compound impacts to, amplify displacement further. One of the other things is that we know with a lot of certainty that increased frequency of extreme events is going to pose risks to habitability of settlements. And this is particularly true, of course, as under higher emission scenarios. So as warming increases, that displacement, we know very clearly, all the projections show that is going to higher warming is going to lead to higher displacement. So now, I know that we didn't want to focus too much on the problem, and I think we kind of understand that. I'm just showing this as one of the ways that the IPCC was trying to then think about what does the solution space look like. And this is just an illustrative diagram for coastal cities in particular, because a lot of the conversation has been around forced displacement from coastal areas inland. And this diagram really, I'm not going to go into too much detail. I know it's very... it looks rather complex, but the basic idea is that there is, here we denote one starting point, but of course there can be many starting points, and you have a range of options that go into the starting point, and you can take different pathways. The pathways can be advanced pathways, that is that you actually move out into the sea and reclaim land. Many cities are doing that, but we show that this can be detrimental and very short term. The second is you can protect. Lots of places are doing that, where you build sea walls and storm barriers to sort of protect your coastal areas. Then there are strategies of accommodating in place. So things like increasing the height of the floor plinth of buildings and things like that. And then finally, retreat options, which is what we are interested in. So actually retreating from the coast through planned relocation, through ensuring that there are no build zones and so on. What we show in this is that, of course, while these are, if in an ideal situation, all these options are equally available, but in reality, we see that planned relocation, of course, there's a lack of local acceptance. There are some people who are moved while others aren't. On the one hand, you have very high investment real estate coming up in coastal cities, while marginalized fishers and other communities that don't have that kind of purchasing power actually being displaced often against their will. So while all these options on the left are shown as equal in some ways, they aren't all that equal when you think about the repercussions of these. And just one more thing to add is that we've got these options, but there are also between these options certain things affecting each other. So when you do make when there are options such as advancing into the sea and reclaiming land, they can actually have secondary impacts on relocation as well. So we have, the example of the Garuda seawall in Jakarta, where there is a massive seawall being built, and that has led to relocation of communities to make space for those kind of protect measures. So while planned relocation on its own is a strategy that is being employed, but then other strategies are further impacting displacement and planned relocation. So it's important for us, and I think we don't understand that well enough and aren't able to then model it into the future well enough, that how different actions are actually it's not only climate change, but also different actions we are doing to address climate change might also lead to the displacement of people. So that was my bit from the IPCC and the large overview. But then I just want to talk about some of the work we've been doing in India to really localize it a bit and also understand what does this mean for people on the ground. And I'll talk a bit about, I mean, Scott, you mentioned, you were asking Aro about what India is doing. And I'd like to just touch upon that a bit. This is a project that we did for 3 years called Recovery with Dignity on the east coast of India, which is battered by cyclones. Almost every year, there's a medium to high intensity cyclone in the region. And there's been a lot of activity that's taken place, but most of it has been focused on relocating people away from the coast with mixed outcomes, I would say. All right, so just to give you some context, I mean, this is a map of India. I'm focusing on a site in southern India, a state called Tamil Nadu, which has a long history, as I said, of cyclones, but also was quite badly impacted by the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. And there have been a series of floods also, mainly in urban centers. And as a result of those, a lot of fisher communities from the coast were relocated into these high-rise colonies inland, I mean, moved away from the coast. And as you can imagine, that has very deep impacts on their livelihoods. Another site that we were looking at was a more rural site where there are a range of livelihoods such as fishing, of course, but also harvesting salt from salt pans, a lot of agriculture and horticulture, cashew plantations, a big thing in rural Tamil Nadu. And again, one of the key ways that the government thought about reducing risk for cyclone-affected or cyclone-exposed populations was relocating them away from the coast. Now, this is what some of these relocation housing projects look like, funded by the World Bank, by ADB, and so on. This is housing stock that has been created much in advance of these events. And when the events occur, the disasters are kind of used as a way to move fishing communities into these high-rise buildings. This is just a 4-storied one, but I have visited 15-storied, very cramped, poorly ventilated structures that also trap heat, and most unfortunately are actually built on wetlands. So you've got people moving out of areas that are at the coast, on the coast, affected by cyclones and flooding, moving into this new housing stock, which is then built on wetlands and again is prone to flooding. And so in the 2015 floods, which is almost 10 years after the tsunami, again, these households were flooded and they were cut off from any kind of electricity, health facilities, and so on. But the longer term, this is what we see during extreme events, but the longer term implications of this kind of, what I would say, I mean, we call it planned relocation, but it's more unplanned and poorly planned relocation, is that there was, because people were moved away from the coast, there was a complete loss of livelihoods. They were moved away 40, 50 kilometers away from the city center. And so there was a complete breakdown in even the ability to access other livelihoods, if not fishing. But what was more troubling to see is these cascading impacts on just the social structure of the community. Neighbors were completely, I mean, social networks and social capital was eroded, and there was a lot of violence and issues of safety in these new housing complexes. Apart from this, of course, these are the things you can measure and see and talk about, and the government also has done after the relocation, has had post-relocation studies to look at the impacts of this kind of work. But the non-economic damages is what tends to get less reported on, and we found a lot of stories about just a yearning for the sea, not being able to go back to the sea, not being able to fish, which is something that has been a livelihood for generations, and a complete loss of a certain way of life. So we were interested in really trying to understand, why is this happening? I mean, if on the one hand, the government is thinking about planned relocation as a way to reduce risk, and that's what they talk about when they talk about reducing vulnerability and reducing exposure to cyclones and flooding, then why are we repeatedly finding ourselves in this situation of poor housing, displaced people, and a complete breakdown of the social fabric, really? And this is what, at least from that project, we found. I mean, many other people have spoken about this, but I think it's useful to, again, go back to questioning what does the idea of relocation really try to do. What we found is that from the government, from the international donors, even the international humanitarian agencies, risk reduction is really seen as infrastructural, as build back better, as tangible, visible, something that can be counted. And therefore, you tend to focus on housing and relocating people into structures that are deemed sort of more resilient, safer. But so this is one vision of recovery and adaptation, I would say. But on the other hand, when you talk to people on the ground, this was an exercise we did with various communities, relocated communities, trying to understand what their visions of recovery would be. What would resilience mean to them? And these are some of the pictures that they drew. So the ability to fish, the ability to have your temple being restored. I mean, this was a group discussion we had in a community where the temple roof had been completely blown off by a cyclone in 2018. And then a sense of having trees, having public spaces that are green and that enable people to come and congregate in. And then, of course, other resilience strategies such as having cyclone shelters and being able to just go back to school and things like that. So why I'm showing this is because we have to understand that these representations of recovery are very different when you look at it from the top and when you look at it from the front lines of climate change. And there seems to be a mismatch between this idea of building back better versus what people actually think is better for them. And then, of course, I mean, I didn't want to only focus on the problems. We do understand them. There have been some movements now in these relocated colonies to make them more safe and make them more inclusive. And I think in some ways moving towards resilience. I would not say they denote resilience in any way, but some of the ways that have been showing promise is, first of all, whenever the government has engaged and really leveraged the power of local NGOs who know these settlements extremely well, there has been a lot of ability for people's voices to come up, and then there have been changes made to these relocated or these settlements, these new houses. There have been changes in terms of lighting, in terms of public spaces, providing spaces to play, greenery, all of that. So there has been a move. I think whenever local NGOs have been involved, there has been a lot of positive outcomes. Of course, much delayed, but they have shown promising results. The second thing, in terms of from our own research, we showed that wherever there have been mechanisms that ensure fast and transparent grievance redressal, they have enabled people to make these places their home much faster and actually build a sort of sense of belonging to these new homes. So the visibility and the transparency that is there in the state, if that is prioritized, there seems to be higher chances of these kinds of relocations being more inclusive. But these are still short-term measures. And then if we look at the medium to long term, I think there have been, again, a lot of interesting examples in the city of Chennai where there have been initiatives by coalitions of non-governmental organizations and the state government to invest in placemaking. And one example is of urban farming, where now schools in these informal or these relocated settlements, schools are being given a small pot of money to start these small farms, which provide some amount of nutritional diversity, a little bit of food security, and that food is then used in the midday meals that are given to school children in these schools. So it's sort of a nice way for people to come together, grow something, use that to also diversify their diets. And so I think these are some ways, and people have spoken very deeply and very meaningfully about some of these initiatives, especially around food growing. And then finally, I'd just like to say, I think the government, of course, this focus on Build Back Better and ensuring zero casualties, really, that's the stance that at a national and a state level has been taken that we need to ensure no deaths due to cyclones and floods, which I think in principle is something no one can disagree with. But in practice, what that means often is that people are being moved away from harm rather than trying to build resilience in situ. And some of the things that are being done in situ are, one is early warning systems for fissures. There's a lot of investment that India has done in this space, and I think that has helped a bit, but it's certainly not enough. For example, many of these warnings are given on mobile phones, which tend to typically be with men in the household rather than women. During cyclones and things like that, you often aren't able to charge your phone, and therefore this system of warnings can often break down during hazards when you need them the most. And then there have been some initiatives on building climate literacy. Tamil Nadu, the state that I've been talking about now, has brought in climate change into the primary school curriculum and then moving up right up to college, which is interesting to see. And we really need to, I mean, this has only been a recent thing, and we really need to track how these kinds of climate literacy programs might possibly lead to people being more aware of them, and then also perhaps resilience building in situ rather than having to use this last resort kind of strategy of moving people out. And then just while we were talking, I added this last slide because I think I've been talking a lot about forced displacement and planned relocation, but there's the other side of the mobility story, which is movement of people voluntarily, autonomously from rural to urban areas. And I think this actually is part of a 5-year-long project that I was part of, where we were trying to look at rural to urban migration due to water scarcity and drought. And here what we found is that on the one hand, people are moving out of drought-prone dryland areas and these climate-sensitive livelihoods such as farming, pastoralism, and so on. So many people talk about this kind of movement, which is voluntary, as an adaptation. And while on the one hand, when you look at it from the rural, it might look like people are reducing their risk. But then when you come to urban areas, people are actually moving into new kinds of risk. And we have charted through very detailed life history interviews these stories of people moving in and out of risk across rural and urban areas. And we find that actually when people move into urban areas, the story is very different. These are the kinds of houses. This is from Bangalore, our own field work, where people are living in these informal, very precarious housing conditions, often in flood-prone areas. So they're moving from a drought-prone, dry area into a flood-prone city. And often their understanding of risk, their strategies to manage this risk really just fall flat because it's a completely new risk regime they're entering. And so these are the kinds of challenges that we need to think about. And I don't think that our governance systems, but also our financial systems are geared up to think about this changing nature of risk as people, traverse this rural-urban continuum. So this is my final slide. I've been talking for quite a bit, I think. I just want to say, of course, these are some things we already know. We know that displacement is going to increase because of climate change. And there is very little debate around that. I think the numbers are quite clear on that. We also know that people move or are moved not only because of climate change. There are multiple drivers, and this kind of argument has been made multiple times. And we do what we know very clearly is that climate change really consolidates underlying socioeconomic vulnerabilities. So it's almost like a layer upon which existing vulnerability, and that is what is driving this movement. And of course, we also know that who gets to move and who is pushed out to move is really differentiated, and not everyone is equally asked to move. And these differences are intersectional. By that, I mean that your gender, your caste, ethnicity, income, livelihood, all of that intersects to shape whether you get to move or you don't get to move, and whether you have the agency to stay if you want to. So I think this bit we know quite well. And I'm also drawing on the IPCC's work to say this because we assessed thousands and thousands of papers. So I want to tell the research community that please, let's not focus on this. What we do need to focus on is this part, the right-hand side, which is, first of all, there's too much focus still on rapid onset events. And we know much less on slow onset events and displacement. This may not be so true of, say, sub-Saharan Africa or even the MENA region, but when it comes to South Asia, Southeast Asia, there's an inordinate focus on rapid onset events. Understandably so, but we also know that land use change, drought, desertification, all of these are also going to be leading and are already leading to displacement. And we just don't have comparable, robust data sets on this. The second thing is that we still are, the jury's still out on whether movement of any kind, whether forced or voluntary, denotes an adaptation strategy or not. And this has kind of led us to this conundrum of using very vague language in the IPCC around displacement and migration. And the big question here is, what metrics do we use to assess the outcomes of movement? And one, we can talk about risk reduction, number of people being whose risk is reduced, but also there's a further gap, I think, around what are the outcomes of movement for mitigation. So when you have large populations moving out of certain areas, what does that do to emissions in the destination areas? And there's absolutely no literature on this. The third thing is that we do know some bits about what enables inclusive, I mean, displacement itself has a negative connotation, but successful movement of people, I would say. We know that there are certain policy and financial levers, but I think we need to unpack this a bit more. And what does this mean in certain regions? I don't think we have a good idea yet. The next one, really, I think this is something that's really at the cutting edge of climate research right now. There's a lot of talk about limits to adaptation, but there's less discussion about limits tend to be spoken about in terms of, for example, many of you must have heard of the human body cannot survive 35 degrees wet bulb temperatures. And so we have, for some things like temperature, we have good, clear indicators of what these limits are, but we really don't know what are the tipping points for displacement. Like, what is the limit beyond which people have to be moved? And this, again, of course, is very context specific, but even that, the literature on specific contexts around limits to adaptation in place aren't there. And then finally, I think Aro alluded to this, the link between displacement and loss and damage. There's a policy conversation on that, but perhaps for countries, and especially both at national and subnational level, I think there's very poor capacity as well as understanding of how do you build institutional, financial, and really data management architectures to understand this link between displacement and loss and damage. I know, at least I can say for India, we really don't have any sense of that. We're barely struggling to get our database on disasters and just material losses and damages in place. So thinking about displacement, which is something that actually country governments don't want to really report on, what are the innovative ways we can really capture this and build systems so that all our action is evidence-based rather than just conjecture.
Well, that was excellent. Thank you very much. Really insightful on so many fronts. Let me just ask one question before we move to Arif. So, one of the very important points that you made covered the whole question of remaining in place, remaining in situ, as opposed to planned relocation, based upon the findings not just in Chennai, but I think globally, that stretch back decades. I mean, that me and Arrow and many of our contemporaries knew about decades ago, that, planned relocation, involuntary resettlement, whatever you want to call it, virtually never works. And it's often touted as this great solution for, slum eradication and other things, and forced evictions, of course, the issue I've worked on so much, and so many other things. And I think if you took 1,000 examples in the world that have taken place, whatever, since the beginning of the Bretton Woods system, because so many of them are funded by those institutions, the number that are truly successful is minuscule compared to the ones that aren't. So, putting our eggs in that planned relocation basket as climate displacement activists should really, in our view, and I think you would probably back this based on what you said, put way at the end the spectrum of options. Absolutely not the first option. It's the last option, because it does not generally work. And even in the small number of cases where it has occurred thus far in the last 10 to 20 years, for instance, in Fiji, where a number of planned relocations have already taken place or are underway, with with a lot of well-intended people trying to solve a difficult coastal problem in small village-like settings, they're finding that even moving a community 1 kilometer up a hill, a fisherfolk community, has had catastrophic consequences, even though they all got the same kind of house and it was higher up it was protected from rising sea levels and storms. Simply transporting their boats, which they felt they had to do, their main possession, up a hill, was impossible. So they had to change their whole source of livelihood, and there were no livelihood options there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, that's one example. The Chennai example you showed it as graphically as could be, that 5 or 6 story building for people that are, traditionally fisher folk people, I mean, just doesn't work. And we all know that. So, and it raises the bigger kind of overarching issue, I think, about so many responses to climate change and the inability of people to live places is the increasing danger that we face. And Arrow indirectly alluded to this as well in terms of, scarce resources. If we're not careful, this whole question of planned relocation, et cetera, can simply become yet another pretext for achieving things that could not otherwise be achieved through normal political means. So we need to be careful of that. We need to be very careful, of course, with the huge potential for corruption that exists within this context of increasing flows of funding towards these activities. And we need to go back to the basic lessons, which is essentially ask people what they want. The crucial ingredient that's often never put on the table at all. What do you want as a person living or community living in this particular area? And I think history shows that the overwhelming majority want to stay where they are, if at all physically possible. And I think that also we could, look more deeply into that question of what are the, not just financial, but technological and other advances that have been made in recent years that might allow people to actually stay longer where they are in a safer way than they're currently experiencing it. And that could be as simple as, having a program that provides stilts, that makes houses 3 or 5 meters higher than they are now. At least they'd get to stay 20 years longer, or even floating villages, which is increasingly being tried in, advanced countries like the Netherlands is doing it in a larger and larger scale. Even Lagos is doing it now in Nigeria. The Maldives is currently constructing a 20,000 person floating village on the outskirts of Male, the capital, blah, blah, blah. And, those are kind of pie in the sky things. I mean, I was in Kiribati several times, and one time there was a Japanese group of gentlemen at the president's office where I was waiting, and I said, "Hey, what are you guys doing here?" And they said, "Oh, we're selling a product." And I said, "Oh, what's your product?" Because I thought it would be fertilizer or like a fish processing plant or something. And it's like, "We have artificial islands for sale." And this is 10 or 15 years ago, and they were selling it at that time for $1 billion US, in a country with a GDP of 350 million. So there's a lot of unrealistic kind of alternatives that are being put on the table that would allow people to stay in a vulnerable situation. But I think there's a lot of more reasonable ones that people would choose if they were actually asked. And so maybe you have a comment on that before we move to Arif, and then we can discuss it further.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. And just to finish the Chennai story, I guess when the people were relocated, the Chennai Metro came up in that same area, and a big privately funded hospital. So those which are key infrastructure were thought, that area was thought to be not so risk prone. But I think I completely agree that when you ask people, everyone wants to stay. 10 years ago, I would have completely agreed with you that we need to find ways for people to stay back. But just given the kinds of projections that are expected for some of these regions, the 5 meters still, whatever, the 5 feet stills aren't going to help in some of these places. So I think that is what I meant by these limits to adaptation in place. We don't understand them well, and we're sort of lulling ourselves into believing that, flood insurance at the coast and things like this are going to help us deal with this. It might be for the next 20 years, but definitely not for the next 50, 100 years. And especially for many countries across Asia, where a lot of the infrastructure is yet to be built, we've got to be thinking long term. So we can't be thinking of small fixes. And that's my only thing. But of course, I think planned relocation, and that's why in that pathways diagram, it comes right at the end. It's the high regret solution that there is. No one wants to relocate from their home. So I completely agree with that sentiment.
Yeah, and I think the way to to fill in that gap really is another thing that we've been focusing on a lot, and which also Aero mentioned and you mentioned, just the whole question of land. And we've done tons of research looking at the scale of land that's actually. We often work from this very macro perspective, we leave the micro stuff to you. We do the macro kind of weirdo way of looking at the question. And, we've calculated that only 0.14% of the Earth's land surface is needed to provide enough land to every single person who's potentially displaced by climate change. Okay, just to make the point, it might be 0.17, it might be 0.11. It's in that range. There is no question that we have land available, right? And it's a question of obviously the quality of the land and things like that, but there is no shortage of supply. The shortage exists in the context of the will to make it happen and the interventionary possibilities of governance in a particular country to allow that to occur in a way that really benefits the most vulnerable in society, and I think that opens up a whole positive Pandora's box of what we can do in the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years in terms of planning ahead for once, because climate change is being served to us on a silver platter. It's like, guys, here's your chance. You have a chance to act not in a responsive, reactive way, but in a proactive way, and start really thinking ahead of what will be possible down the road and what do we need to, where should we put our resources now at the macro level so that we can actually address this problem in the most, constructive way. And so
just to quickly jump in for a second,
sure.
I mean, just
totally
provocative on this. So there's no shortage of land, fine. There is a deep shortage of place. And this whole thing is about place in some senses, right? Whether it's place and people, place and culture, place and infrastructure, etc., especially in such highly densely populated parts of the world. I think that's the issue. And places tied to, to markets, places tied to property, it's tied to, frameworks or whatever it is. And it's deeply unequal. I think that's the real question here. It's not a question of land. Land exists, of course, and you can replace land with land and stuff like that. And places tied to ecosystem services. So if people can't survive in those places with the kind of skills and livelihoods they want, then that's deepening inequality in some senses. So yeah, sorry, just jumped in.
No, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And it raises the bigger issue of the really huge issue of it, our current forms of government and governance capable of tackling a problem that can potentially affect structurally more than half of humanity. Are we really in a place today as a global community of 8 billion equal people to look to our individual 195 governments and say, okay, it's on your shoulders, start solving the problem, And the more I look at it and the more I see and the more I speak to people everywhere in the world, I'm hard pressed to find one government that's up to it, let alone 195. And I think it's again that climate change on a silver platter is saying, guys, this is your chance to consider what form of government you want to have globally to solve a problem that is clearly global more than anything else. There's not a single human alive today or in the future that's not going to be impacted in one way or another by climate change. In many cases, it will be severe. In others, it will be slightly less. And some will even benefit. Right? People living in northern climates, arguably, in their own way, as the temperature warms, they may be able to do things they're not able to do now, but the rest of the planet will suffer as a result of the ice melting, etc. But anyway, everyone's going to be affected. So do we really have in place today the best form of governance, the best form of political organization to enable us to structurally address a problem that's going to affect us all? I think we all need to think about that. And let me just plant the seed. So let's try to end today. I'm going to ask everybody participating when we end shortly, what's one thing that we should do today? And, that you think should be done today in order to, push us in the right direction. So I'll just leave that for the moment. So let me give the floor now to Arif from IPSA, who's speaking to us from Chittagong. Arif, take the floor. And thank you again, Chandi, for that excellent intervention.
It's a great opportunity for me to, share some of the experiences and also what's going on in our country from Bangladesh. So I have one presentation. I think the Christine will share. So, it's like a great moment for me as our organization, and I myself was active part of the Peninsula process. So it's a good moment to look back what's happened in our country after the Peninsula Principle adopted. So the 10 years already passed. So obviously there is a many good news, already something happened in the macro level and also at the micro level in our country. So I would like to share some of our hands-on experience, and at the same time also see what type of challenges actually we are facing and what can we do from now. So, I already mentioned about the 10th anniversary of the Peninsula Principle, and our organization and I was the very active part of that. Yeah. So the key climate displaced challenges. So I'm not going to share all points, but some of the very latest information from our country. According to the IDM's report, 4.4 million, which is the third in the world, people already displaced. In 2021, in 2022, in Bangladesh due to disaster events, which is 15% of the total disaster displacement in 2020. Recently, 2022 flood in northeastern part of Bangladesh displaced 480,000 people in our country. And this month, the August 23, devastating the flood in the southeastern Bangladesh. Where I'm actually residing, the Chittagong, Coxbazar, the hill tracts area, affects 1.2 million people and displaced about 44,000 people. And then the flood is actually still is going on. So currently on an average, total erosion in Bangladesh is 3,000 hectares per year, displacing approximately 25,000 families annually. So these are the latest the information from the ground. We are facing the challenges. So with this reality, our government, I'm thankful to our Bangladesh government. Government has taken a different initiatives. If I look back to the last 10 years after the Peninsula Principle, so the government has taken various initiatives, adopted a different macro policies. So some are I would like to share just to know about our policy frameworks in our country. National Strategy on the Disaster and Climate Induced Internal Displacement in 2021, followed by an action plan, which is National Action Plan up to 2022 on the internal displacement, which is one of the very good and appropriate the policy documentations, the National Action Plan. So based on that, our government has taken the various initiatives, and as a civil society organization also, we also follow that National Action Plan. And then the Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan up to 2030, that plan in line with the SDGs. That was also the last year it was adopted. And then Bangladesh Delta Plan for coming 100 years. This also adopted in the 2018, where the displacement issue are included in that document, and also the prospective plan of Bangladesh up to 2041. So, and also the updated standing order on disaster. The standing order on disaster, it was previously, but in 2019 it was updated, and where displacement issues also adopted. And then expansion of Asrayan project. Asrayan project is the apex, the prime government initiative, the relocation projects for the landless and the displaced people in our country, which is the government sponsored, government initiated, the ever biggest the projects called the Asrayan. So the ASRAN projects also now covering the displaced people. And every year, government, they allocated a huge amount of money for the ASRAN projects to covering the displaced people. So over the last 7 years, if we look at the last 7 years, the budgetary allocation, we have seen the budgets are already have been doubled and increasing from the 1.44 billion to the 2.96 billion. So this is the based on the Ministry of Finance information. And also the Green Climate Fund, the Bangladesh also become like one of the part of the active part of the Green Climate Fund. So through the GCF country program, the ND identified the 48 priority projects after review and analysis based on multiple criteria. Over 230 initially submitted projects, and it accessed the 441 million for 9 projects. So this is the, like a good news for our country that the Bangladesh is getting resources from the GCF. The macro policy framework, which is adopted by our Bangladesh government, progress happened on the loss and damage issues. So Scotland made a symbolic 2 million place in the COP26 as a way to encourage the other countries to follow. And IPSA, as a civil society organization, we are lucky enough, we are very fortunate to become a part of this this fund as a partner of the CGRF to implement some specific projects in our country. In COP27, the summit, nearly 200 countries agreed to set up a loss and damage fund to support poorer countries. So this is also one of the good news for us. And then during the COP27, the few governments have made relatively small but symbolic funding commitments for the loss and damage, like the Denmark, Belgium, Germany, Scotland, and Australia. They already allocated the funding for that. The civil society organization has been very vibrant to work as a pressure group for the climate justice with the focus on the loss and damage. So from our Bangladesh, IPSA and also some other the civil society organization, we are also very active on that issues, and we are working at the national and international level. And government across the world are under pressure to introduce more climate change related policies. So these are the a scenario related to the loss and damage issues. Yes. So as a civil society organization, IPSA, as a part of the displacement solution, as we had a good partnership, and IPSA, we are very much actively engaged with the addressing the climate displacement, especially last 1 decade. We are working at the macro level and also at the micro level. So we are developing the real case stories and that is we are updating to the technical paper of the NELs, and then also the grassroots, the lessons learned shared with the loss and damage funds, the transitional committees, and also the through the different forum, and also the joint civil society submission on the climate change and the human rights in Bangladesh for the 4th cycle. So as a civil society organization, our one of the role is to share the case stories from the ground zero, and also we develop and also publish the different articles, interviews in the different international media, and regularly we are participating in the different international seminar and the meetings, and also raising our voices. And also we actively participate in the COPs in 2018 with a very specific side events. And IPSA increasingly its participation in the national and international the forum to share our hands-on experience, and also on behalf of the displaced people of country, we are raising our voices and we are sharing our hands-on experiences from the field. And also at the same time, we are also implementing some very specific projects with the support of displacement solution and CGRF and also the Bangladesh government. So there is a very specific projects we are implementing in the some of the projects, like name is the addressing the rights and needs of the climate force displaced people in the southeastern part of Bangladesh. And also there is a projects, one house, one family projects is going on with the displaced people. So our organization, as a civil society organization, we are very active in the macro level, and at the same time also the micro level, working directly with the displaced people in our country. Yeah, so our strategy to addressing the rights and needs of the displaced people are like three major strategies actually we are following. One is the like a demand side. So we are very active in the demand side to build the capacity of the climate for displaced people, forming the community team members and especially youth forum for claiming their rights and alternative livelihood skills. And also in the supply side, regularly we are advocating and the campaigning with the relevant stakeholders, especially with the government stakeholders for rights-based solution to the climate force displacement. So the demand side and supply side, both way we are working together. And then planned relocation, repairment of the loss and damage and for durable solutions to the displacement. So we are implementing the model project to show the government and also to show the other stakeholder what could be done and what is the appropriate, and also what we are learning from the community-based relocations, the projects. So we are informing it to the government, to the different stakeholder, and also the media to inform it to the people. So this is my last slide. So based on this situation and also the working experience, now we are prioritizing and also the proposing like some of the area where we can invest our more time and energy to deal with the climate displacement in our country. So point of origin with the trapped people and the point of destination with the migrated people, each and displacement solution and other organization can do the activities. So advocacy with the duty bearers at the point of origin and destination. So that advocacy should continue, and then form the community team and build their capacity in the entire the coastal and the island areas of our country. So this should be continuing, and then engage the young people to work as a change agent. We found that our young people, they are the very vibrant. So we need to work with them closely to help them to become like a change agent for rights-based solution. And then campaigns through the community team members, awareness raising sessions among the displaced people, and then access of the people to the social safety net program of the government. In our country, the government has a very large social safety net program. So but unfortunately, displaced people are not covered. And regularly advocating interventions to help displaced people to access that government's safety net program. And the need-based the skills development training for the alternative livelihood, especially for the displaced people who came to the urban area. There should be a skills development training and then input support to ensure their alternative livelihood program. And then the drinking water and sanitation is one of the challenging area where we need to emphasize on that to support the displaced people. And the community-based, the planned relocation as a durable solution. Already we have some proven model, the community-based, the planned relocation. So that should be scaling up in the other parts of the Bangladesh. And then continuing ongoing CSO initiative at national. There are many policy formulation already in place, and the government has a specific budget, but need to regularly advocating with the at the national level so that the resources can come to the climate displaced people. So end of my presentation. So in my last slide, I would like to show you our slogan: let's ensure new land for lost land, new homes for the lost homes for the climate for displaced people. And we are very thankful that our organization is the part of the Peninsula Principle. And after the adoption of the Peninsula Principle, we are trying to promote it in our country at the micro and macro level. And we are working together with the government, also with the other CSOs. Hopefully, this journey will continue. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Arif Bhai. That was excellent. Excellent overview of the situation. And thank you too to Arif and your colleague Shah Jahan and everyone else at the thousands of people that work for IPSA for the One House, One Family program that we do jointly together. We're up to 14 houses now that we've built through this program, and just about to start on the 4th phase. So hopefully we can build 16 more houses in the 4th phase. So thank you very much for that. Let me just go on to Ray, and then come back to everybody making a final statement or questions for others before we move on.
Yeah, so basically this is just like a protocol, no? Because I'm a consultant for a Green Climate Fund, technical advisory member for the executive board, ADB, Partnership for Infrastructure, DFAT, and ProClimate, Singapore, India, and Sri Lanka. So basically my opinions here are my own and does not reflect in any way the institutional roles that I currently have or previously had. So I will not be critiquing any work that I've done or I am doing, but I'll cite some of the good examples as I could. No? So just to prevent any potential issues or conflict of interest. Yeah. So my approach is basically looking at it from a climate finance perspective, no? Because this is the space that I'm working in. Okay, so this is how I see the development problem for the climate displacement. On the development issue, I address a slow mainstreaming of housing, land, and property rights in the climate change development agenda. And there are 3 causes, which is 1, lack of weak climate HLP policies amongst government actors. And I think this has been mentioned in some of the presentations. Then you got fragmented or limited institutional mandates on addressing HLP issues because they're maybe housed under the Disaster Management Committee, the Climate Change Commission, the Housing, Public and Works, whatever. So there is no dedicated entity or institution managing that. The third would be lack of dedicated resources. These could be financing, budgetary resources, or even advisory. Okay, so to address the HLP issues in climate, no, because right now it's just like an add-on, always being parachuted in. Okay, the some causes of that. This is based on the write-up prepared by Scott. No, so this could be due to limited capacity of vulnerable stakeholders to formulate demands and climate justice in ways fully consistent with their rights under human rights laws and obligations incumbent on governments to know, respect, protect those rights. No? So there is that issue. Same thing on the other one, limited or lack of guidance on climate displacement issues amongst governments. No? So there is that issue. So here I'm trying to answer of what are the key regional displacement challenges in 2023. And this is how I see things based on the work that I've done with all these institutions. And what measures are government in your region taking to address climate displacement, what works and what does not work. Just before I go into that, if you notice the effects would be climate HLP issues not methodology integrated in priority investment development plans, strategies, and measures, national and local governments. So this leads to relocation programs and sites for climate displaced people that lead to degradation of land, ecosystem resources, could be forest, could be water. Okay. Then you also have a case wherein climate displaced people increase carbon footprint per capita because these displaced people, when they're transferred outside the city perimeters, that increase their carbon footprint for transport, for business, and the like. If they don't have energy, they go to resort to the wood. They make charcoals out of this. Okay? They use plastics, whatever that works for them to survive. Then you have typical business as usual HLP approaches and programs and projects development implemented. When I say BAU, in a way you create perverse incentives, no, to communities that are already at risk. Okay, like in Philippines, for example, maybe people are already like at risk forever when you live in the coastal areas, but people don't want to get out of that high risk area because they get what? Social programs, cash transfers every time there's a disaster. It's like fiesta. Okay, so these are additional cash inflows for them when there is a typhoon. So that makes you wonder why they want to stay there because there is an incentive for them to stay. Twisted as may be, but that is a reality. Then you have tokenized or piecemeal approaches on capacity building or enhancing people's HLP, depending on the institutional mandate of the government actors, because there are many silos in each and every government. So it is they're limited by their own mandate. So they cannot really totally focus on HLPs themselves, right? So this is only what they can do within the public works or housing or within climate commission or with disaster commissions. No? So given that, no, what are the possible interventions or strategies that we could try? So in this case, because of my finance background, I'm looking at addressing the lack of dedicated resources, financial and advisory, to address HLP issues in climate. Because when you do that, you address the key issues of mainstreaming climate in the HLP, the development agenda. When you mainstream all these in the development plan, strategies, measures of national and local governance, so then you also address that in the business as usual HLP approaches. Okay, so the interventions I'm looking at are all highlighted in green, and the greens on the effects are also highlighted if you try to do these things. Okay, so this is where I'm coming from, beginning with limited stakeholder consultations on HLP across climate displaced communities, because I think there's never been a full discussion on this, because it's been like, okay, let's just go through the process and process them, and that's it. Give them the help, the assistance, and so on and so forth. But no deeper understanding. That's why the slides presented earlier on about projects being tenements, 3-4 stories high, they don't work because they were never consulted in the first place. They were removed away from their livelihoods, okay, from their social networks, communities. Okay, so there is that need to bring different technical expertise. Could be IT related, could be livelihood related, could be resource related, no? So as to address those issues that we are trying to focus on. Okay, I highlighted here the GHG emissions component because this is one thing that I think, like what was presented earlier on, there is not much literature about that. But if you look at it, there is a strong carbon emissions footprint when you do displacements, no? Because like here, it caused land use change, degradation of forest, no? When you displace, when you put people displaced by climate in these areas, okay? So there is that emissions component. The transportation component, there is emission. The MSA business value chain that happens when they process from production all the way to the market, no? So there is that carbon footprint. Without electricity, they will use whatever is available. It could be cutting trees, whatever. It could be using diesel gensets and so on and so forth, just to survive all the way in that space that they were allotted or assigned to. So there is that opportunity to address that when you do these displacement issues now. Okay, so my strategy here as a conceptual vector could be to accelerate the mainstreaming of housing, land, and property rights in the climate change development agenda. So that is the main outcome I'm looking at. In terms of strategic interventions, I'm looking at one, climate HLP communities formed institutional mandates on addressing HLP issues. No, so you have a secretariat or technical committee at the government level. So this output will address Peninsula Principles 13, 16, 17, and 18. I've just put in there what is like more likely feasible. No, but this will be this will be output 2. Okay, will be supported by output 1, which is innovative funding approaches developed and submitted to development agencies to address HLP issues in climate. No, this could be HLP climate policy loans. For all we know, there are existing HLPs, but they are not articulated well. So we need to find where these things are. We could also look to HLP linked climate bonds. Okay, we've been seeing green bonds, but there is no HLP linked indicators there. So you can match this with development agenda with climate impact investors or development funders, development agencies. You can also do HLP linked climate risk parametric insurance. This is what is the tipping point for them to be displaced. Insurance kicks in to address some of those issues like loss of capital, loss of assets, loss of livelihood. So this addresses Peninsula Principles 8, 9, and 12. at least. What are the other activities underneath that? Well, you can see one international. We could begin with the stakeholder consultations, climate HLPs, issues across climate displaced communities in partnership with centers of excellence, IIHS, schools, with the local and national governments. So that addresses P10. Going up, you have international regional partners formed to provide and guidance on climate displacement issues amongst governments to better protect the HOP rights of people and communities affected by climate displacement. So that also right smack into PA. Okay. Then we formulate climate project funding proposals with HLP indicators. So that is important because that's the only way we can finance these things. We can always be all activists. You don't have financing, there is no project. We'll be scraping the bottom of the barrel, but if we can formulate an idea, a project that has HLP integrated in this whole concept, then there is a strong fighting chance that we will get financing. The climate finance market is evolving, and this is the time that we can bring this up. This issue has not been addressed for so long. I've been into this space for since 2000. It's just now that we are beginning to discuss it, and it should be mainstream in the climate development agenda. And if you look up all these things, what would be the effect? One, climate HLP issues methodologically integrated in priority investment development plans, strategies, measures, national and local governments. So that's across several peninsula principles. Where you can see these ad hoc relocation programs will not become ad hoc anymore. They'll be well planned. Relocation programs and sites properly selected for climate displaced people, supporting government, either reforestation, afforestation programs, which are eligible for carbon sequestration, like mangroves and degraded plants. Why do I highlight this? Because this is the other pocket that you can get financing for. Under Article 6, this is open. So we can package it in such a way that we can tap into that cross-cutting development project, mangrove reforestation, where displaced people can live in and build up their resilience by putting up nature-based solutions against storm surge, do MSME business value chains emanating out of that ecosystem. Then you also mitigate emissions. Number two, when you plan it properly, you develop climate smart communities. No one has to travel 24 kilometers just to go to a job or a work. Like one good example is the Indonesia, new capital city, where everything is like within 10-minute time framework. So that is good planning. If they do that perfectly, I think that's one good example that we can emanate amongst governments from different parts of the world. Then the other one, transformative HLP approaches on programs, projects, developments implemented. P14 and P15. That hits it, no? Then when you do targeted incentivization of communities at risk, what are we talking here of? Inclusive financial products, social cash transfers, okay? Climate-proof facilities, like the one in Bangladesh, the plinth, raised storm shelters. That is a good incentive for category storms 1, 2, and 3. But 4 and 5, you have to be out. No one can be protected on those terms. So. But it provides the correct incentives to displace people and enable them to return when there is no risk anymore. So if you look at this, you address GHG emissions, you address vulnerability, you pursue sustainable SDGs, you create paradigm shifts, and therefore there is a low carbon climate resilient trajectory for the developing countries. Now, I'll stop here, but because there is a lot going on around this place, but it gives you a nice framework by which to address this time, including mitigation and adaptation. And addressing this could be a cross-cutting thing, and this is right for the taking when you look at climate finance. Okay, so the next step probably will be what you call how do we address the maybe secure country ownership from the local communities, so that there will be ownership of this whole project. At least we begin with that. then we formulate all these questions and formulate that concept note and move forward. No, we can discuss more on those details now in the interest of time. So I'll stop there in the meantime. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ray, for those eye-watering charts. You're famous for your charts. very, very good. You know, and it raises this whole question of financing, and you know, once again, we work on so many of these issues from the macro perspective. I mentioned the land question before. We did this calculation, 0.14%. We also did a calculation as to how much it would cost to adequately rehouse the median number of people that will be displaced by climate change in the coming 50 years. And we came up with the number $1.7 trillion. Now, the global economy right now is $85 trillion a year. So if you extrapolate that along a 10, 20, 30, 40 year time frame, we're talking about hundreds of trillions of dollars. We only need 1.7 trillion. So the actual amount is not that high. It's high, but it's not as high as people think. Again, it's a question of, we do have the resources to do it. We don't have the will yet, and we don't have, you know, the widespread enough agreement as to the pathways that we could use that money to be spent on. I should also point out, by the way, that during the first year of COVID, the richest 3,000 people on planet Earth collectively between them made, exactly by coincidence, 1.7 trillion additional dollars over what they had in the year before. So it's not like that money's not there. It's a question of getting it and making sure that it's allocated in the right way, so that we, again, you know, in a way, turn the negative of climate change into something positive. We have to try to see this problem and this challenge as an opportunity to solve otherwise intractable problems, such as inadequate housing in the world. And, you know, that's why we always look at this question through the lens of HLP rights, housing, land, and property rights. And this is an absolute opportunity once and for all. Perhaps it's unrealistic, but nonetheless, you know, we do have a planet today where a very significant proportion of our fellow human beings do not live in adequate housing, right? And it's been a collective failure of all of us and all governments since the end of the Second World War to achieve this very basic objective of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and everything else, that everybody should have a decent place in which to live. We have not yet achieved that, and in many respects, we're going backwards. We can use this climate change challenge as a kickstart to push us in that direction. And if I believe, you know, we certainly have the skills to do it, we need to develop the will and the sense of urgency in governments across the world and international organizations to do more on that front. Should also point out another one of our little figures that we came up with recently in the context of this campaign on the Peninsula Principles is that we discovered that there's over 40,000 people working at the UN and other intergovernmental agencies specifically on the displacement question. Far less than 1% of those are dedicated in any way specifically to the question of climate change and climate displacement. So we have massive strides to be made also there within the context of the international agencies. No one is going to get a new home by knocking on the door of a UN agency today. So one of the things that we're pushing for right now, and the report that we're releasing on Friday, by the way, is a very simple, very clear plea to every government in the world to begin the process of establishing a national climate displacement ministry that could once and for all coordinate activities governing consolidated responses to the question of climate displacement, migration, other manifestations of the problem. So, thank you for that. Let's just go around the room in the same order that we started at today. So with Arrow, if you could suggest one thing that governments in the world /UN /civil society, any institutions that are working on climate change and climate displacement could do starting today, a practical and realistic perspective, please, what would it be? What message can you impart to the international community of things that should be done, both internationally and, of course, domestically?
Thanks, Scott. That's a trick question. There's no one magic bullet, you know that. But I think,
know.
just to start with very practical stuff, the stuff that Atif showed us from Bangladesh actually presents a fairly comprehensive response across the state and civil society systems. I would like to see a little bit more of private sector inside that, because for better or for worse, financing comes in from other spaces and it changes a whole range of things. And what we've just not been able to pull together actually is market-based responses. Maybe they don't exist. So I mean, if you're able to just pick up and build on 3 or 4 local to national level responses like that are comprehensive, that involve a whole range of frameworks, that would be, I think, a very useful thing to do. Because part of shifting the narrative is actually presenting narratives of systemic responses. I mean, we can go into a long discussion of what needs to get done and how we're out of touch with reality in many cases, including new political settlements, but I won't go there just now, or even liability for that matter. These are questions that are going to potentially land, if we still have it, in The Hague at some point of time. But I mean, we don't have a traverse from here to there, and that assumes that we're going to have the same regime of governance that we have just now. But these are all Holocene frameworks for governance. They just don't work in this kind of framework. And most of the things that like I said, are really patchwork, band-aid kind of processes, assuming the current constitutional frameworks work, that the same legal frameworks would work, etc. This is a completely different world that we're about to enter, and we're going to enter this really quickly. And even indigenous populations, in some senses, who have lived with these changes and actually know how to do this culturally, some of these shifts are going to be so quick because they've amassed that knowledge and those practices over the Holocene. I think even they, who actually have, I would say, much of the cultural and social sort of repositories that we need to traverse this change, even they may be seriously challenged to deal with these kind of things. Forget about people who are stuck in places. City dwellers, they're stuck in place. So after a point of time, the seawalls and all the other kind of things that we're going to do are not going to work. We've known that. I mean, we wrote about this in 2014, 10 years ago. And by the 2070s, the way that we're going is now, there's no difference between Dar es Salaam and New York. It doesn't matter how much money you have, how much technology you have. Once you're past 2 degrees centigrade, your ecosystem services will start collapsing. Your food systems will not work. We have no idea how to farm or manage in this kind of systems that are there. So yeah, internal displacement obviously is an issue, but the assumption that the Westphalian state is going to actually hold up and manage these processes is a huge assumption. So I mean, I don't want to go there, but I'm saying, so Bangladesh, and I think some of what Ray just showed us just now, in the short run, are things that we need to put together, because the SDGs are going to be recalibrated. That's for certain, if you're still going to have them. And while that is happening, and while maybe some additional resources from climate finance is available, we have to use a thin wedge to try and get together whatever cracks we can use in the intergovernmental system, because it is more fragmented than I think it's ever been. I mean, certainly since '89, and maybe even before that, at the current point of time. So getting a global consensus to deal with a systemic global question is almost out of the question at the current point of time in the negotiations. I've seen this very closely in the last few years at the UN. At national level, it's also very contentious in many parts of Asia. So the practical politics of this thing is not going to be easy at all, and etc. So I'll kind of leave it there. Thanks.
Well, let me just ask you one last thing. So if you did raise the governance issue, which I constantly raise. So how do we get from here to there? How do we make it in time to a more global superstructure of humanity sharing the same citizenship, the same governance system, the same overarching political powers that are capable and willing to actually tackle this problem? Are we ever going to reach it, or are we not going to reach it? What do you think?
The question is the kind of cost that it will take in terms of both in terms of lives, livelihoods, etc., HLP, to really get people to wake up to the fact that, I mean, essentially, these are not even national political settlements that are required. These are much larger questions. And even in the great political transitions of the 18th century. Nobody's asking this question at the scale we're talking about. And they were asking that for populations of, 500 million people, 1 billion people, even, in the Declaration of Human Rights, we're talking about 2 or 3 billion people. Now we're talking about 10, right? Completely different class of problem. And every system is disrupted, every system is changing at the moment. So it requires an act of remarkable statesmanship. Plus, I think movements from below, from the middle, etc., to make this possible in an environment which is actually going completely in a different direction. There's a large part of the world that is betting on climate change. You can be a national government just now and do what Northern Europe did in the 19th century and essentially dig a lot of fossil fuel out of the ground, become rich, and live in a fortress world. The system, the financial system, the governance system is actually incentivizing that, and it'll actually happen for certain communities. So that's a reality that we're living with. So yeah, it's a huge. Like I said, this is a fundamentally different story. We are in the Anthropocene. It requires a different imagination, and I think Westphalia, everything that's been built on that, etc., are very, very dim echoes of what we need to do. So I think this is a deep question in politics and law and jurisprudence, but it has to start with action on the ground, as we know, right? So I would say start with Atik and various other colleagues who are doing this kind of stuff. Build that up, show that there's a viable system forward, and then maybe something will happen. There'll be a huge conflict in that process. Business as usual doesn't mean it's just not an abstract term. There are powers and forces that are in place that will not let go, in spite of the fact that they will eventually drown. But the hope is that there's a frontier. And the richest people in the world are looking at frontiers on other planets at the moment. So till we change that, that's not work. That's why I said there's no lack of land. The issue is of place and imagination and culture in that place. That's the issue. So governance in the Anthropocene is going to be very different from governance in the Holocene, and we've forgotten. I mean, well, at least technically, we're 70 years into the Holocene. The geologists have come back and said 1950 when you first get the first plutonium residues in a lake in Canada. That's when the Holocene started. So we've been going for a long time in this. I mean, the Anthropocene started rather. We've been going for a long time in this process. It's just the acceleration that's starting this now. So we need action, we need politics, we need deep thinkers in this process. And we need inspirations in some sense, asking some really hard questions. This is a new form of social contracts that we require. Much, much wider than the 18th century ones, which are the basis of a lot of what we're talking about. It's a different story.
Right. Well, we've had the Westphalian system since 1648, and pretty much everything else in the world has changed except for the ways in which we manage ourselves politically. And so after 400 years, given all the changes that have taken place, this might be the time that we start thinking about the biggest questions of all, and I think it's indispensable. If we don't do that now and figure out a way to merge our energies together in a much more positive, unified planetary direction, we all know what the outcome is going to be. It's just a question of how severe and at what time frame. So
and it's not only just
personally.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I honestly, if there was any other alternative scenario for a better planet in the future, I would select it. But I can't find one, and I think about it every day. For decades, there is no other way forward than unifying our species together and fighting against this. It's the equivalent of the alien. It's the equivalent of being attacked from outside. We have it here on our planet, and it's called climate change. And if that doesn't bring us together, then nothing will.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's not only just 1642 and the Westphalian state. It is the coalition between the Westphalian state and the first stock markets and the first joint stock companies that came up in 1602 in the Netherlands and other such places that's got us to where we are at the moment. So we're looking for a new Rousseau, Scott.
That's right. That's right. Well, it's very hard to speed up evolution, right? But we're all part of it. So anything we can do to kickstart evolution and in political terms, we should do it. So thank you very much, Arrow, for all those insightful comments as always. Chandi, how about you?
To move from that macro picture to what I do, which is really very, very place-based kind of research. But I think one of the big things that come across repeatedly is institutional capacities are one of the key barriers. But that's become kind of a catch-all phrase, what capacities, and that's what I really like to drill down into. And I think a little more analysis and then communication of what barriers are there in the institutional space are important. So I'm thinking of things like just really grassroots government officials being able to understand climate risk, the links to displacement, and then actually being able to build capacity, us being able to build capacities to make decisions under deep uncertainty, because a lot of this, the kind of cascades that we're going to see through the system because of climate impact drivers are not very well understood. Some of them are better understood than others. The links that Aro was talking of, food, water shortages, then having implications on livelihoods, then leading to displacement, and all of that. So I think there needs to be some more conversation on what capacities need to be built institutionally. And there are various levels of institutions, of course. At an international level, things that you were talking about, but then at national and subnational levels, it's going to be very different. And I think that's a critical stumbling block. So, of course, the examples from Bangladesh are really interesting. I think there's a moment of crisis, and that visibility of the climate crisis being so pressing, which is why Bangladesh has now taken this route to even having national plans on relocation and displacement and all of that, which a country with a large coastline like India has not been able to, and there's no conversation around it. So there's a sort of cognitive shift that needs to happen with policymakers, and for that, I think it's a capacity problem. It's really talking about changing people's mindsets around how they understand displacement and then preparing for that. As you said, Scott, right? It's proactive preparations, not reactive policymaking. So I think, of course, the finance is extremely important. Without that, nothing can happen. But almost as important is the story of capacities. And maybe one more thing to say is, I firmly believe that good development, basic delivery of development is like the bedrock of any kind of risk reduction. So if we aren't meeting our SDGs, we can't even aspire to think about climate action. And so some of the messaging, and that's what's happened, the climate conversation has sort of moved away from that conversation of just delivering good development. So again, in the IPCC, we show that if you meet certain SDGs, you are meeting some of your risk reduction strategies, and then of course you have to risk reduction goals. So there's some link that is missing in the messaging around displacement and relocation, that good development in source areas perhaps is one way to enable people to adapt in place. I think it's been made several times, but now with the climate conversation, it's kind of got displaced itself in the whole agenda. So yeah, those are my two thoughts, really.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you very much for all your insights and for coming today. Arif, any final thoughts?
Yes. I'm actually echoing with the Chandi. Is like, like this, we have like a national plan, or also like most of our policy frameworks in place now. So the question is the proper coordinated effort for implementation. So we found that at the ground there is a less coordination among the different the actors. So the effective coordination should be in place, and also develop the capacity of the implementers. Actually, who is responsible for implementing the national policies at the ground? We found that there is a huge capacity gap. Is where the civil society organization and also the other international organization can contribute to develop the capacity of the implementers, and also help when the capacity is in place, So there should be the good coordination among all the stakeholders can be developed. So I found that based on our experience, the capacity gap is like one of the big challenges now. So we should focus on and the political commitment. You know, the policy framework is in exist, but plan on time. So these are the issues I would like to add here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Arif. And thank you for everything you do on climate displacement. And we're really glad to see that you're back in good health, my friend. Stick around for at least another 40 years, please. Thank you. And finally, Ray, some final thoughts?
Yeah, just that, no? So what we know is that what is constant is the land. What is variable would be the people, institutions, and the place by which to relocate people. So we need to develop that place with the help of government or private sector. We need technical capacity to develop skills, education for these people, technical capacity for the government to put this in technical needs in place, the policies in place, institutional machine to make these things happen. And most of all, you need financing. That's why in my slide, I went straight. It is a concept note proposal. It is a problem tree assessment. So you can play around with those things and determine which is the best approach to address this issue. So that's it. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Ray. And thanks to everybody for coming. We should all stay in touch with one another and think about ways in which we can collaborate and cooperate down the road on all of these issues. And do whatever we can, obviously, to push these issues higher and higher up the political agendas of the world, both nationally and internationally. And just keep in touch, keep looking in at the Displacement Solutions website, and keep up the great work, everybody. So thanks again. We'll see you soon. Bye for now.
Bye. Good night.
Thank you.
So welcome everybody to this small, intimate gathering to discuss climate change and climate displacement as part of our big project for the year on the Peninsula Principles on climate displacement within states. And we're hosting a whole series of different local and regional meetings with dozens of people across the world to get the latest thinking on how to best tackle this question of worsening climate change and worsening climate displacement, but focus in the case of both of you in particular to the fact that neither one of you really can operate from within the borders of the country from where you stem. And that has a very distinct series of implications in terms of how we tackle climate change, given the fact that activists and politicians as yourselves are not able to operate freely within your own country. So we want to focus particularly on that topic here today. Maybe very quickly, I can just introduce us. If you look, so I'm the director of Displacement Solutions. Viraj there is one of our legal researchers on the project that we're doing now. Kirsten is also a project officer at Displacement Solutions. Win Mutu is the founder of an NGO, several NGOs in Myanmar, the main one being EcoDev and also Alarm. He's the leading expert on forestry matters and housing, land, and property rights matters within Myanmar. He's currently in exile in the United Kingdom. We have Sean Buta there too, who's a legal researcher with Displacement Solutions and an HLP expert. And then, of course, His Excellency Lobsang Sangay, former president of the Tibetan government in exile, and somebody that I've known for a long time.
No, in exile, just a small thing, yeah.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Yes. So in essence, as we all know, Asia is particularly negatively affected by climate change. 4 out of 5 people globally who will be displaced by climate change are from Asia and live in Asia. So it is really a disproportionately affected region. I would say safely, having worked on this issue for 20 plus years, there's not a single government you could say across Asia today that is, or anywhere for that matter, but since we're speaking about Asia, that is sufficiently tackling the question of climate displacement, and both in terms of prevention, but also in terms of remedy. So the problem is growing. The problem is so severe, in fact, that large cities such as Jakarta have already made a decision to move. Discussions are already underway in other mega cities across Asia to discuss the possibility or the likelihood of eventually having to move. And then added to that, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of villages across the tens of thousands of kilometers of coastline across Asia, of course, are also heavily threatened. So bearing all of that in mind, and bearing in mind also your unique situation, Lobsang and Win, what are some of your thoughts on the question of climate change and climate displacement? And let's just start with Lobsang. So Lobsang.
Thanks, Scott, and good to see you, Win, online, and all the experts who are working on displacement and environment. Of course, I'm not an environmentalist, but I have a law background. But as a Tibetan, you have to speak on all the topics and do research. But I can claim that before I got law degree here at Harvard, I got a diploma on environmental law in Delhi. So I do have small credential to speak something about environment. And, as a Tibetan, I'm asked to give, a lot of talks. So, I've researched a bit and written reports when I was the president of Tibetan Government Exile by experts, and I wrote forward. That's my expertise, okay? Yes, Tibet is very important as far as environment is concerned. Himalayan region as a whole can be described as important, if not more important, than rainforest of Brazil because of its delicate nature. Himalayan region as a whole is very delicate. Biodiversity in flora and fauna from every point of view is very delicate. And also, Tibet happens to be called the roof of the world, and also the source of major rivers for, a large part of Asia. For example, I had some Burmese, visit Dharamsala and told me that the rivers that's flowing from Tibet to Southeast Asia, you name it, Irrawaddy, Salween, Mekong, and their folk songs, they all say, hey, our water, our rivers originate from Tibet, and and many tribes have also moved to Southeast Asia from Tibet, including a few in Burma. That's what they say. And for example, Yangtze River and Yellow River, they are lifeline for China. Actually, the cradle of Chinese civilization, if you look at it historically for thousands of years, it was between Yellow River and Yangtze River, because that was the most fertile area and largest number of Han Chinese live there, and both the rivers originate in Tibet. So obviously, Communist Party of China came to know the value of this. Hence, they felt that instead of, keeping Tibetans as the owner of the land, they thought we should just go and, take ownership so that we can protect the source of, rivers. And, for Bangladesh and Assam and northeast of India, Brahmaputra is lifeline, right? And then from Indus River to, Indus River, which flows from Tibet through Kashmir to Pakistan. Again, it's lifeline for that area. So Tibet as a whole is very important because China, with a population of 20% of the world population, has only 12% of fresh water, meaning 8% or more than 500 million Chinese are already facing water scarcity or fresh water scarcity. And the situation in India is worse. Situation in South Asia is getting bad. And then, situation in Pakistan, we all know that area also is equally bad. And the source is mainly one, that's Tibet. Unfortunately, with the, forced migration or population transfer of Han Chinese moving into Tibet, now for them, you have to provide housing, roads, electricity, food, and everything, thereby urbanizing the Tibetan plateau, thereby contributing towards the increase in temperature of the Tibetan plateau, right? And thereby glaciers in Tibet melting faster than it should be, And then mining, So Tibet has at least reported around, 123 different kinds of minerals and at least 250 recorded, mining areas where mainly Chinese companies, but also Canadian companies like, mining gold, and Australian other, mining companies from around the world have gone to Tibet to exploit these mining areas for the minerals. But because mining means you need land. And then to get land, these are already occupied by Tibetans, either by nomads or farmers. So when they see through survey, there is a potential for any minerals, they connive with the Chinese government and local authorities force Tibetans to, displace or relocate them to other areas, right? So Human Rights Watch report in 2013 reported that around 2 million Tibetans have been forcibly moved either from nomadic area or farming area, allegedly for unsustainable reasons, right? Now, later you find out that these nomads and farmers who were moved from these areas, mining is taking place, in all these areas, right? Now, these displaced people or who were forcibly moved are provided some kind of housing. But then, if you are lifelong nomads or farmers, if you are moved to a ghetto-like, housing nearby highways, what do you do? What is your source of income? Nothing, right? So government claim to provide 500 RMB yuan a month to families, but they barely covers their electricity and water, basic utilities, right? What about their food? What about their children's schooling, education? Not much. So 60% of those Tibetans who were moved to this, 2 million Tibetans who were moved to these housing places are unemployed. And now what happens is the crimes will go up, and then the younger generation, especially the most precious generation, will be without proper education, without proper upbringing. What do? So again, these are related to environment because the Chinese mining companies, they need this land to mine. And then if you study the case of Inner Mongolia, worse cases, right? Worse, in fact, because Mongolia is also equally rich in mineral resources. And if you also look at Xinjiang, also very rich, in uranium and, iron and, and then Inner Mongolia, I forgot to mention, is very rich in rare earth. 90% of the rare earth of the whole world at the moment is excavated in China, of which 90% comes from Inner Mongolia. And rare earth is the essential component. Any gadget, any electric vehicle, any missile, anything you have, you must have rare earth. And China has monopolized that. Thereby, if a Chinese company uses rare earth, they get it at a very cheap rate because they never pay anything to Mongolians, right? They extract it without paying anything to locals. But if American company or any foreign company, they want to buy rare earth in China, they must buy now, they are dependent on it. You must pay 10 times the price. So on the one hand, Mongolian nomads are moved, forcibly displaced from the grassland and they are taken by Chinese companies to, mine rare earth, right? Which the Chinese company uses. And that's why Chinese products are so cheap. Again, up to 70% of lithium in China is found in Tibet, right? Uranium is found in Tibet. Gold, copper are found in Tibet, right? So again, you have to, what do you call, monopolize this land, and only way you do is forcibly displace or remove these nomads and Tibetans from farming areas. So hence there is environmentally devastating because of all this mining taking place, and socially devastating for Tibetans because they are forcibly moved from where they have been living for hundreds and thousands of years to roadside houses where they don't know what to do. And then economically, they're deprived of any source of income and they are suffering, right? And then if you read the testimonies of Tibetans, they all say that we have no option. Government tell us to move and we have to move, or you go to prison. They always say it's for your own good. But in the end, they'll end up seeing all these Chinese mining companies going to our areas are mining the same land, which the Chinese government claimed to protect so that, they could be removed. So it's a vicious cycle. So that's what the Chinese government is doing. Because of mining, again, the temperature of Tibetan Plateau is increasing. So as I said, compared to rainforest, the whole of Himalayan region is very delicate. If there's 1% increase of temperature, rest of the world, Tibetan Plateau, it is 2%. Right? Now, with this mining, with this urbanization, with this infrastructure, with this moving of population, more urbanization and mining of Tibetan Plateau, more temperature increase, meaning the glaciers of Tibet are, melting very fast. Now, if you compare to, I have photographs to show. If you compare to 1930s and 40s photographs of all these glaciers in Tibet, compared to now, half or more of those glaciers have melted and disappeared. And there's not enough rain, that will replace the glaciers being melted. And 2030, which is in few years, is a tipping point. More glaciers will melt, then the snow will cover the mountains again. So it's the tipping point. Hence, again, who suffers? Yes, Tibetans, but mostly Chinese people will suffer. Right? So you have photographs of last year where Yangtze River drying up. Right? So you have rivers in Southeast Asia and in other parts of South Asia where rivers are drying up. So because of this climate changes, either there's a major flood, in Pakistan, right, which swarms large part of Pakistan because glaciers are melting so fast, and then the cloud bursts, all these climate changes are negatively impacted, and the outcome is severe in climate, from climate point of view. So protecting Tibet as the plateau for its glaciers, right, for its environment is very, very important. That's why even Chinese environmentalists have said we must declare Tibetan Plateau as a national park, so that we can protect it for our own sake. And then lastly, 70% of the Tibetan Plateau is permafrost. So essentially it is, ice underneath those, grasses. Now, because of this increase in temperature, permafrost is melting very fast. And what happens? What is underneath permafrost? Methane, right? So methane is released. Now, methane is, some say 20%, 20 times or 30 times more stronger than carbon dioxide, right? Now, if that amount of methane is released, on the Tibetan Plateau, it will have major ramification for whole of Asia. So hence, because I have to wrap up, Tibetan Plateau is very, very important, from environmental point of view, and displacement and forced, removing of Tibetans in whole of Tibetan Plateau is severe. So out of 157 Tibetans who committed self-immolations, who burned themselves, And 90% of them died. 30% happens to be those nomads and farmers who were forcibly removed from their traditional home. So that reflects the severity of the situation in Tibet from environmental point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lobsang. Let me just ask a few questions before we move on to Win. So, well, first of all, obviously the People's Republic of China government considers Tibet to be an integral part of the Chinese homeland, and that's a view that's not shared by the entire world whatsoever, in particular by the Tibetan people and their supporters who consider it occupied land. In the context of everything that you just said, if China, sees and treats that land as its own, obviously it's benefiting from the mineral wealth and the income that's providing. But at the same time, as a nation as a whole, the way they see it, they're also in effect shooting themselves in the foot. I mean, they are now clearly at the present moment in time the world leader in terms of CO2 emissions by a long ways. Hasn't always historically been like that. The country where you're sitting is the #1 world record holder for the most period of time for CO2 emissions, but at the moment it is the PRC. So, I mean, have you noticed any, you're a keen observer, obviously, of Chinese government policy and law and practice. Have you noticed any adequate awareness within government circles there of the severity of the problem? I mean, structurally speaking, they've passed their peak population moment in time. The population is already on the ascendancy. It's already declining. Most projections point to it being less than 1 billion in the not too distant future. So that's going to have a massive impact on their overall economic standing globally as well. So you can imagine all the competing pressures as well as the centralizing of power, etc. But do there must be awareness amongst people that and speak to within the Chinese government of these problems. And is there anything positive you can point to that can be built on to, for the rest of the world to sort of focus on as something that could be supported in terms of actually recognizing the problem and trying to reverse it?
And actually, if you read some reports by Chinese environmentalists, they have come out with reports, which are alarming. So they have said, we need Tibetan Plateau. The glaciers are the source of all our water, and unless you protect the Tibetan Plateau, our future generations will be deprived of fresh water as it is. As I mentioned, around 500 million Chinese are facing scarcity of fresh water. So now, obviously, this environmentalists, are professors and lecturer researchers in government-owned institution. Without their permission, it will be difficult to come out with the research. So they do claim that they have sent these reports to highest authorities of the Chinese government. Do they know about it? Yes. Are they doing anything about it? Not much. Mainly because, you must understand, as you mentioned, Tibet was an independent country. And for Chinese government, control of Tibet is more important than the rights and freedom and environment of Tibetan Plateau. So how it works is they outsource it to local authorities. Whoever is sent as the governor or the party secretary general and the military chief of intelligence are told, you control the Tibetan Plateau, right? Control protest. And then, we look other way. So now these local authorities will send reports saying they had, Tibetan Plateau, didn't have protest or decrease in protest in the last few years. So that's the statistics. Beijing is keenly interested. And now what do the local authorities do is they have agreements with Chinese companies coming in. They say, hey, you come and invest on the Tibetan Plateau and I get my cut. Now tell me which land and which area, which mining place you want. And then there's my Chinese companies, sometimes in partnership with Canadian companies, Western companies as well, including Australia. Okay, it's called "You're Not Free." So, and then they say they point out this land, and so okay, we'll get rid of all these nomads and farmers, and obviously Tibetans are forced to do it. And then as long as stability, control is maintained by local authorities, Beijing is happy with it. And what happens environmentally at local level doesn't count. So yes, government is aware, environmentalists are aware. So they have, in fact, come out and say, we must declare Tibet as the national park or the national reserve, area. But Chinese government and government officials, ignore it. Now, yes, population in China is decreasing. It could go below, 1 billion sometime soon. But the Tibetan landmass is huge. It's 2.5 million square kilometers of land, which is as big as Australia and California combined, or whole of Western, Europe. It's huge. It's huge. Population is only 6 million, right? So for Tibetans, even if 1%, 0.5%, of Chinese population move to Tibet, that will be like, 14, million, so that's unacceptable, unsustainable as far as Tibetan Plateau is concerned. So there is no, decrease in population doesn't help because, China has this colonialistic policy to swarm Tibetan areas and Uyghur areas and Mongolian area with Han Chinese. They think that Han Chinese will be more loyal to them. So forced transfer of these people, they're heavily subsidized and heavily incentivized to go to this area. For example, and, Communist Party member who has a degree from, a third grade universities is barely getting a job. They are given option. Hey, if you go to hardship area like Tibet or Uyghur, Xinjiang or Mongolia, we give you promotion. So what would you do? You say, yes, I will take that. So you get one promotion to go to Tibet, and second promotion after 3 years of hardship service. So you get double promotion in 3 years. Why would you not do that? But in the process, what you do is you send the lowest level, below average kind of officials to Tibetan areas. And then, interestingly, so on their way back, every year during their holidays, they are allowed to take 2 or 3 truck loads of anything you want from Tibet. And what do you take? Timber. So that's what they do. This is how they're incentivized, right? So they're promoted, you get higher salary, and then every year you get, 2-3 trucks load of anything you can take. I'm sure nowadays they take some minerals as well, so they are given like, blank check. So this is how it's being exploited and incentivized. So there is an inherent contradiction with what the Chinese environmentalists are saying, and the Chinese leaders know about it. But then the system that's imposed on Tibet, makes it very difficult to have policies which is environmentally sensitive, and culturally sensitive to Tibetan people.
Right. And of course, just a reminder to people that don't know, His Holiness the Dalai Lama for decades now has been, using terminology that's well short of independence and proposing a, autonomous status for Tibet, a zone of peace, a nuclear-free area, all sorts of, very big concessions that would also promote stability within the People's Republic of China and provide a useful buffer zone between the eternal Indian enemies of China, et cetera, et cetera. But those have unfortunately fallen on deaf ears. But what it makes me also, what your talk is reminding me of course, is, the lengthy history of population transfer of Han Chinese people into Tibet as a very clear, intentional policy by the government in Beijing to ensure that, Tibetan attempts to have greater autonomy and more independence are always going to be snuffed out. But my big worry in terms of climate change, beyond all of the things you're mentioning, which are, of course, vital, is, both Shanghai, the two biggest cities in China, both Shanghai and Beijing, are under existential threat from rising sea levels and perpetual flooding. And that could lead to a situation where 20, 40, 80 million people are displaced in need of going to somewhere else. And where do you think China is going to attempt to put these people, a country with a massive, lengthy history of forcibly relocating people? My worry, of course, is that they're going to put them in places like Tibet, Xinjiang, other parts of the country which are less populated, and thereby making the problem even worse in so many contexts. So thank you very much again, Lobsang, and thank you so much for coming. And let's give the floor now to Win to talk about another very difficult situation in the country of Myanmar. And as we all know, they had a brief window of democracy from 2011 until 2021, at which point the military decided to have another coup in February 2021. So we're already well into the third year of it. So Win, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott and Dean, so giving me a chance to talk and share my thoughts on this important subject of climate displacements. So I would like to begin my, intervention, so by giving some data reflecting on the vulnerability of the climate change, climate vulnerability in Myanmar. So according to the recent data compiled by United Nations, so at least, there may be 8.5 million of people vulnerable by the storm surge, cyclone and storm surge. And then there will be another 28 million people, will be potentially affected by the flood, in the country. So if you study on the drought, at least another 4.5 million to be affected. For landslide, which will be occur in the old hilly region, at least 1 million people will be affected. In total, at least, it's accounted of 60 million people. It's equivalent to the 30% of entire populations. So I think this is a general figure, recently how Myanmar is vulnerable. Also, if you look at to all, global report on the climate vulnerability, Myanmar stood as the second most vulnerable in the country because of the, potential assets, because of the poor, vulnerability and governance, poor governance. So combining these assets and vulnerable, the climate risk in Myanmar is very, very high. But this figure maybe also gives some alarming, I think, signal. So with regard to the climate displacement, if you look at to the area like, Rakhine State, remember in 2017, there is at least 500,000 people, fled from Myanmar to Bangladesh. This Rohingya community fled. Of course, they are living in the area, very narrow coastal line, where they compete these, coastal resource with local native people. Then there is a community violence, then some military suppressions, military operations there, they fled from the country. So now they are living in the, I think, the refugee camp in Bangladesh. And then Bangladesh government also, relocate some of them from the, their Cox's Bazar refugee camp to the some island in the Bengal Bill, So they are also very vulnerable to, climate change. I just read the news last week that, there was a one, boat, carrying at least 30 to 50, Rohingya people. They're trying to sail from Myanmar to as well, where they can find a better place. So that these people were also sunk and dead, there's a dead body. So there is a socio-political, problem as well as climate change. Because in March, I think in the May this year, there was a cyclone, storm called I think Mocha hit that part of the area. then no one can go and, deliver the emergency aid because we have a problem of political, deadlock situation because we have a two government system right now. We have a de facto military ruler, and on the other hand, we have a de jure elected, government, both are fighting each other, and all these, development agency and humanitarian organization, they cannot go and operate, for those needy people. So this is a challenge now we are facing, So that's why if we want to address these climate, issue, we also have to address a political issue at the same time. Because these political deadlock, of course, because of this, the different, political attitude they have on, fighting each other. But at the same time, I would like to, remind all the global community about their political deafness. They are not really listening to the voice of the, people of Myanmar, especially to the West, because, if you look at to the, international community responding to the Myanmar crisis, they are giving all these responsibility to the ASEAN. As you know, ASEAN, they don't have any institutional capacity to address these Myanmar, situation. But even though the West know that, in efficiency of ASEAN, they are electing ASEAN to lead the process. So to me, this is very unethical. If you are the medical doctor, the medicine you have are not curing your patient. You shouldn't give that medicine to those patients, right? But the West are giving that medicine. They are not curing the patient. So this is the problem of our neighbor and global community understanding the situation then and neglecting the voice of their, people there. So that's why not only political problem, these natural disaster and climate change problem, they are compounding each other and having a more negative impact on the local community, creating the challenges, for the people like us who are trying to address the climate change and trying to save the people through our emergency operation. So we are now very, very difficult situation, to provide that assistance to the needy people. These are some challenges we are facing. So I would like to stop by, introducing this difficulty, for the time being.
Okay, thank you very much, Win. And of course, both of our NGOs work together with Sean, by the way, on this idea of setting up a climate land bank in Myanmar. So we came out with that report jointly in 2018. And I mean, you might have some comments on it, but at the time when the political situation was fundamentally different than it is now, I mean, now that would seem like an absolute pipe dream, absolute, you wouldn't even propose it because there's no chance of anything happening. But at the time, 3 years before the coup, there was interest in this within governmental and ministerial and parliamentary circles. And small steps were being made. So maybe you can comment on that idea of the climate land bank. How do you think it could have worked in Myanmar?
Yeah, we collaborated each other, to do that study on that land bank, and we advocate to the government. At least government took the concept of the land bank, but in different format, because they are much more interested in this sort of, promoting international investment in land bank, So, okay, there's also element of, relocating people from the from the area where people can no longer live there. But at least there is some message. We made it true. We made it together, and at least government accepted. But during this military ruling period, of course, we cannot do anything. But again, I'm also trying to see how we can address that issue. Right, so that's why part of my research I have been doing in Oxford University. So how climate vulnerability, and risk assessment could be, done at the subnational level. Because in general, because I give you the figure of, okay, there may be 29 millions or 60 millions or 30% of population affected. Who will be the most seriously affected? So we need to know, because our resources are always limited, to address the climate change, adaptation. So we need to prioritize, people and area, to start with our resources. So that's why, even though it's a very difficult to operate right now in Myanmar, so I'm doing some research that may be helpful in the future to further address that issue. So I'm trying to look at the dry zone, for example, and the sea level rise and these landslides. So which area, which part of the country will be the most vulnerable in terms of these, natural disaster and extreme weather event? Because the problem of climate change in general, especially in developing countries, there is a lack of data, because even though we have done climate change modeling, but the skill we use are very large scale, so, but to understand who will be the most affected, you really need a downscaling those data level at local level, so that you will be able to determine, which village tract will be most, affected. Otherwise, our data, because Myanmar also submitted our national climate change report to UNFCCC as part of the global, obligations. But again, if you look at the data inside, it's a very broad, very, very large scale. So they only give you the idea, okay, which area will be affected by where, but it doesn't specify further. So that's why it's important to optimal, for the optimal use of our available resources to address the climate, change, then we still need to carry on this kind of, research activity, identifying the most vulnerable and the most risky community. So I'm contributing that part of, the data gap. But the problem is, to be able to do this one, you need a time series data, a lot of data, and then it's also you require the computing facility. You need a very big computer machine to run these, very downscale. It's a very difficult, even not only Myanmar, but also many developing countries. So that's why when I'm working here in the United Kingdom, I really, feel shame, so even though I attended this Glasgow, climate conferences and other, climate global meeting, but there is a limited space for those people coming from the field state like Myanmar or Syria or Afghanistan or like Yemen. What we are doing for these, field states. So, as a global climate change, it's the whole world, but these countries has a less, opportunity to participate and to address that issue. Because all the donors simply, they said, you have a poor governance, you can't do anything in Myanmar, so that they prioritize other FD rather than on this climate change. So that's why, whatever it is, my advocacy is, to those, that at the global level, okay, please pay attention to those field states, find a way how we can address these continue. One part is this kind of research, and, knowledge development that we have to, we have to carry on. And then we know what will be the immediate measure that will be required, for the time being, as well as what will be the long-term measure we can mitigate, some of these climate risks. This is what I'm trying to bridge the gap, at my, utmost capacity. So just to give you some idea of what I'm trying to address those climate challenge with my limited options.
Yeah, and we've had some preliminary discussions, Win and I, also about the whole question of, governance, types of governance and responses to climate displacement, and the way in the different ways in which, heavily democratic, moderately dictatorship, full-scale dictatorship, how they each treat and deal with the question of climate displacement. And I think a lot more work needs to be done. There's no foolproof government system that will necessarily treat climate displacement better per se, but clearly ones that are more predicated on the rule of law and that take human rights seriously, etc., are going to have better outcomes than those where the state is all powerful. And another interesting similarity, of course, between China and Myanmar and a number of other countries which do not necessarily have fully democratic regimes is the scale of state ownership and control over land. And that can be a good thing, but it can also be a very bad thing. And, when we look at Myanmar, my latest book is about housing, land, and property rights in Myanmar, which Wynne kindly wrote the foreword for. You would be hard pressed to find any country in the world where fewer people as a percentage of society enjoy housing, land, and property rights than Myanmar right now. And that is only going to be exacerbated by climate change. Sean has a question there.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Just a quick question for Sia. Back in 2019, I was working with UNDP on land issues in Myanmar. And one of the things I was trying to do was to get the UN agencies to convene a land working group during the process of the national land legislation drafting to get the inputs from different different CSOs and EAOs, and there was starting to be some progress on that. But in the context of this conversation, we know that land will be a very important part of dealing with climate displacement. But I was wondering if you had been able to follow whether the NUG has been paying any attention to the land reform issues, because now, as you mentioned earlier, now we see like Let Badong copper mine starting up again, and there are a lot of problems with other resource extraction like jade in Kachin, and it's going to be a disaster while the SAC is in control. So I was wondering if you had heard anything about the NUG starting to think about what they could do about this in the future, because there's a lot of attention on the federalism issue and constitutions and all of this sort of stuff, but the land is a massive underlying issue. So I'm just wondering if you had heard anything about NUG paying attention to this.
So, okay, thank you for raising that question. So, because I'm contributing to this constitutional drafting, process at present, because, so these NUG that, government in waiting, those, elected, representative, so they're trying to, develop a new federal constitution, as you are probably aware of, right? So part of that constitutional designing, so one important chapter is resource federalism, how these, land and natural resources are managed. What is the role of the central government as well as those, ethnic region? How do we share the revenue, and as well as how we're trying to address these environmental justice, which is very much matter, important issue for this national reconciliation and peace building. So that's why we found some technical working group within those bigger committee, and we are focusing on these environmental justice matter together with other colleagues from our ethnic political organization, ethnic organization, and other civil society group. We are drafting these these issues, the principles. We call it that resource federalism and environmental justice. That exactly raise the issue of indigenous land use, tenure, security, housing, and people property right, things like that. Because when I read the Scott recent book, so I like some of these facts. For example, housing and property and land right need to be part of the new constitutional amendment that should be included. So we are still advocating the aspect. I think we will be able to come up with a new report and a new chapter on that issue. just to share the recent information,
Thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm very interested to follow how the process goes. And I mean, of course, it ties in very directly to the federalism issue, the resource and revenue sharing.
Yes.
So hopefully you can find some agreement with the other drafters on that.
I think to put a positive spin on a negative situation, as far as I can tell from the outside, being relatively familiar with Burma, Myanmar, there seems to be more engagement and more unity amongst the different ethnic groups as a result of the coup than there was prior to that, by a long, long ways. And so if that can be built upon and used as a foundation for a better and more democratic future for the country, then let's let that happen. And in that process, hopefully, HLP rights issues will be embraced by everyone and finally put into place in a country where really, when you break it down, almost nobody has a fully fledged housing, land, and property rights met in law or practice. And there were great steps taken during the democratic period, the window, 2011 to 2021. The national land use policy of 2016 is a really impressive document. I'd urge everybody to look at that. We actually put the entire text of that as an annex to our book, the book I just did with Jose Araiza, because it's such a marked difference between how housing, land, and property rights have been treated ever in the history of the country since 1948 and independence, and certainly since. So, there is awareness about these issues to a sufficient degree in the country without question, but getting them into practice, getting them onto the floor of Parliament and actually, approved and so that they have a real impact on people's lives is another story. Lobsang, do you want to say a couple closing words if no one else has any other questions or anything? And then maybe some closing words by you, Win.
Your point, especially Win also made the point that the property rights be included in the constitution so that all the ethnic groups, whether it's federal system or whatever system you have, the local people benefit. But the oddity of China is that land is owned by the government. And the whole population is on lease. So that's why, nomads and farmers, they cannot go to the court and file a case and saying, I want my land to be protected. I should not be displaced or forcibly removed because ownership of the land belongs to the government, So that is a fundamental problem. So, that's why, they have no legal recourse. So then what do? You have protests, and when you protest, you get arrested, you get tortured, often you die. Then the desperate attempt is you burn yourself as a statement because you have removed from your land, your livelihood, your, family members and everybody. And then you just, burn yourself as a sign of protest. So, desperate, situation, kind of inculcates desperate measures, right? So that's the sad reality in Tibet, and then that's for Uyghurs and Mongolians as well. So China as a whole, we are facing a major challenge because even with neighboring countries, Tibet being the source of major rivers and water, but China has conveniently not signed UN Convention on Water Sharing. Now, again, they're not even, first of all, they do what they want, right? Number two, they're not even legally obligated. Not even the United Nations can go to them and say, hey, you must share water with the neighboring countries, So they're building major dams all over Tibetan plateau. And then, the neighboring countries are very worried that they might be cut off with, a very precious water. And you can't do much about it. Now, significance of Tibet, again, geologically, but geopolitically also. China is the largest populated. Now, India is the largest populated country in the world. China is number 2. two of the largest population, they never had a land border. It was always Tibet as the buffer zone. Now you imagine from Kashmir all the way to Arunachal Pradesh, almost 3,000 plus kilometers of land border was between Tibet and India and Tibet and China. Now this 3,000 plus kilometers of land is undemarcated because relationship between India and China, because Buddhism came from India to Tibet, it's porous, and because there was a bit of a trust and lack of resources as well, right? So when Tibet was occupied in 1959, the finance minister wrote to Indian Prime Minister Nehru saying, hey, we barely had 80, okay, foot soldier guarding 3,000 kilometers of land border. Now, if India doesn't support us now, you will pay the price. So now with the recent incidents of Doklam, in Kashmir, in Sikkim, Bhutan border area, where thousands of Chinese moved in, and there was almost a clash. And Galwan Valley in Ladakh, there was a clash, right? For the first time, Chinese army used batons and rods and sticks and killed and injured 100 plus Indian soldiers and killed a dozen or so. It became a major news in India. It was sensational, and that shifted India's, perspective from being friendly towards India to recognize China as an adversary now. So as of now, 50,000 Indian troops and 50,000 Chinese troops are facing each other in 4,000 meters plus, high mountains, face to face. So this is the tension that's going on. Again, why? Because land border is not demarcated, and China is claiming this is ours. India is saying no. And both sides don't know properly because it belonged to Tibet. Now, because Tibetans were removed, Tibet is removed as a buffer zone, there is a major tension and potential conflict between the largest and second largest populated countries in the world. Now, why I say this is everybody's focused on Taiwan now, and understandably so, because the semiconductor and what Xi Jinping has said, the preparation, all that is taking place. But the second, focal point is Indo-Tibet border. That's where more tensions are happening. So environmentally, yes, but also, for resources, if China refuses to share water with neighboring countries, what will happen? And then the demarcation of border. So, that way, Tibet remains very, very important from environmental point of view and, geopolitical point of view as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity, Scott. And, good to see you all online and hope to see you all in person someday. And we all must do the best we can as far as environment is concerned. Climate change is real. Environmental challenge is real. People are suffering. That's real. And as long as we do something for these issues, it will be for the peace in the world and general good of the world. So that's what, we all should strive for. And that's what His Holiness the Dalai Lama always calls, people around the world to do something while you live.
Thank you very much, Lobsang. Win, would you like to say a few final words?
Yes, I would like to, call for your attention, especially the displacement solution, to lead the process again, similar to this peninsula, principle. Because as I addressed before, there is a lack of mechanism for helping these, failed states to get involved in these global, climate change action, right? So that's why I'm calling for the sort of, brainstorming, on the sort of translateral cooperation mechanism. Remember, when we have climate negotiations, we have a lot of, frictions and competitions and a lot of difficulty in the last 2 decades. But we were able to have a Paris Agreement on 2015. So if you look at to how that Paris Agreements what came out, so that innovatively, sort of international relationship has been, developed. There is a translateral, cooperation. That means not only, G to G bilateral cooperations and multilateral cooperation, there is a sort of translator cooperation between the nation state to the another subnational level, non-state actors, and everyone can get together and make a pressure to move the agenda forward, right? That is how our Paris Agreement has been resolved. So similar to that kind of approach, I really want to call for global attention on creating something mechanism important to bring all these field state on board in our global climate action. So especially for Myanmar or like Afghanistan, Syria or Yemen, if we have a sort of translateral cooperation, mechanism. Remember, in Cambodia or in our, I think, Timor-Leste, we have an UNTEC, for example. Okay, there's to do the something, governance between, during the interim period. But we can also create sort of international mechanism for promoting these translateral, cooperation. By doing so, then those non-state actors from subnational level, like EAO or civil society or other, can officially participate in this translator platform, cooperation platform, and then they are the most efficient and competent to deliver some of the, these emergency assistance operation back home. For example, right now, UNDP or UNOPS in Myanmar, very difficult to operate their humanitarian system. But whereas local NGO, community organization, they are able to deliver something, but they are lacking resources, not like, UN organization. So to solve this problem and to bridge the gap, we really need that sort of creative mechanism, and we need to push, the agenda forward, Hey, look, UN, look, European Union, we have to come up with something that is, valid and solid, this is doable, right? So in that way, we may have that sort of mechanism, operational mechanism, at least to bring all these, field state together. That is one thing I really want to, advocate. Another is a specific agenda for Myanmar, because as we are trying right now to restore the democracy and political development. So as I said earlier, we are in the process of drafting national constitution and so on. But on the other hand, it's equally important. How do we address the Rohingya issue? If we have no solution, still our, democratic, transition will be still problematic. So that's why I think last month I talked with IUCN, some people from IUCN, whether that would be a good idea to do some study. If those, people from Bangladesh, who fled from Myanmar to Bangladesh, when they are coming back, what they are supposed to do when they will be relocated, without having further conflict within the society. So that's why landscape level, restoration, mangrove restoration or forest restoration might have some answer, some potential to address issues. So that's why technically we are looking at that aspect where these people can peacefully fit in and, raise their livelihood peacefully, without having further conflict with local communities. So these are the sort of technical, very survey, we are also planning to do in the future. So these are the two things very important. One is this translator cooperation mechanism for Myanmar and other similar country for climate actions or including land bank study or whatever, and another very country-specific technical study, to continue. So these are the two things I want to raise up, and if development solution can, echo our goal. So I'm very much thankful for your, assistance to us.
Great. Thank you very much, Win. And that the publication that we just came out with on Friday meshes perfectly with what you just said. So, the thinking behind this, and this is drafted by Sean and with some inputs from others, basically, we take the perspective that And the Peninsula Principles take the perspective that every single person, nobody should be displaced by climate change and end up homeless or landless. That's our vision. That's our hope. No one anywhere. And it's incumbent upon states everywhere, whether failed states or not, but particularly ones that aren't failed, which is the majority, to make sure that you have the institutions and laws and policies in place to protect people against displacement, in particular climate displacement. And the very first thing you have to be able to provide as a state is somewhere to knock on the door. Where do you knock? In most countries, most governments can't answer that question yet. So what we're proposing in this report, very simply, is that every state in the world, as a fundamental part of their national government structure, should have a climate displacement ministry or some institution which has legal and political responsibility for ensuring this vision comes true. No one ends up homeless. No one ends up landless. They amass land, they amass resources, they amass other things so that there is enough to go around so that nobody ends up landless or homeless as a result of climate change. So those are the kind, very much in a similar direction. And then also we're working now on the beginnings of a project linking the issue of degraded land and using degraded land in selected countries as a target point whereby climate displaced people could be relocated to, subject to their wishes, and in the process, enhancing biodiversity by building new villages and towns where there's only degraded land now. So trying to use a negative and turning it into a positive. I mean, that's also a fundamental part of the way we work. And let's also remember that we are from one single planet. All of us are the same. All of us have the same rights, and we should be caring and compassionate about the rights of everybody everywhere. And until everyone has those rights, none of us can really sleep easily. So, Win, back to you. You wanted to ask a question?
Okay, thank you. I agree with what you have said on these, these Peninsula Principle to focus and, continue. But one thing we also have to really pay attention is a sort of, regional level cooperation mechanism, for example, on the displaced person, especially for those climate displacement. If you look at Bangladesh alone, there will be at least 25 million of people will be suffer from the sea level rise. So Bangladesh government has been, making utmost, preparation. They developed the regional development planning where these people will be relocated in different town or different region. I'm very impressive. Again, when the natural disaster occur, people will naturally, flee or, go, and then that will also create another tensions between, those countries, especially India and Bangladesh, Myanmar, and, so that's why these climate security issue should be also addressed. But if you look at global consideration on climate displacement, the global north, their policy is to contain those people within their nation state, within their national boundary, and they do not encourage any, principle related to the mobility, global mobility. Of course, we agree these people should be within their home, their native home, right? We should make an effort and help them to be able to adapt and improve their resilience to face with these climate, challenge. But then maybe also the circumstances, as you know, people need to be displaced. In some country, they have no land, to relocate. Then maybe a sort of global movement will be required. But for the time being, global South, global North is, they are very reluctant to address that issue, right? Similarly, in our region like Bangladesh, India, and Myanmar, so I raised that issue in a BIMSTEC. There is a sort of regional platform, Bay of Bengal cooperation, within the India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Thailand, and Nepal. So there's a regular, I think every 2 years, there's a meeting. So I was I attended one of the meetings and I addressed issue. What about regional readiness to address this climate displacement? So politically, everyone quiet. They don't want to raise issue. Again, we have to press the button again. There is also another important aspect, to promote the regional cooperation and sort of mechanisms to address the issue together. As you said, we are living in one planet. We don't have another planet to live, right? So that's why these are the also issue we have to work together in the future.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, and that's a good place to end. The bottom line is, we're stuck on planet Earth, ladies and gentlemen, and what a perfect place it is if we only allow it to be the perfect place that it can provide us with. And, climate change, as bad as it is, and occupation, as bad as it is, and dictatorship, as bad as it is, very often those horrible things serve us on a silver platter the solutions to the reason that they came into being in the first place. Climate change is the ultimate serving on a silver platter to the human race that once and for all, it's time for us to unify and to see each other as equals among equals. And no one's better, no one's worse, we're all the same. This is our chance. Not one single human being on the planet today will be untouched by climate change in some way or another. It's only a question of degree. So let's use that as a positive force, bring us together and find viable, workable, rights-based solutions for everyone everywhere. And I, firmly believe that we can do that, but we have to really get moving quickly because we are indeed running out of time. So thank you again so much, both to Lobsang and Win for joining us today. And let's stay in regular contact and see what we can do together to push all these things in the right direction. So thank you very much, guys. All the best. Yeah, take care.